Hello, my fellow story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. This one is particularly chilling, and it takes place far from the bustle of everyday life on a remote island, where the wind howls, the sea crashes against jagged rocks, and the only constant presence is a lonely lighthouse. I want you to imagine a place where the world feels distant, untouched by time, a place that seems so serene, yet carries an eerie weight. This is where our story begins. The year was 1954, and I had just begun my job as the lighthouse keeper on an isolated stretch of coastline. It was a position I had applied for, hoping to escape the noise of the city, searching for solitude and perhaps a bit of peace. The lighthouse was perched on a rocky cliff, standing tall against the relentless tide, surrounded by a thick fog that seemed to roll in at random. The only sounds were the waves crashing on the rocks below and the occasional seagull calling out as it soared high above. Life here was slow, quiet, and predictable, or so I thought. My days were spent in a monotonous routine, checking the light, cleaning the lantern room, and making sure the lighthouse was in top shape for the ships passing through the dark waters. I was completely alone, save for the occasional visit from a supply ship. But even that felt sparse and far between, making the days stretch on like an endless sea. The nearest town was a good hour away by boat, and the only connection I had to the outside world was the radio, which I rarely bothered to turn on. The lighthouse itself was an imposing structure, its tall white tower standing out against the gray skies. The keeper's quarters, where I stayed, were modest, nothing luxurious, just the bare necessities to keep a person alive. There was a small kitchen, a bed in the corner, and a wooden chair by the window where I could sit for hours, looking out over the horizon. It was a life that suited me well, or so I had thought. At first, the isolation felt like a balm for my soul, a way to escape the stresses of everyday life. But as the days went by, I started to notice things that didn't sit right. But before I get ahead of myself, let me introduce you to the characters that made up my small, quiet world. There was only one other person that played a role in my daily life, and that was old Thomas, a fellow keeper who had been at the lighthouse for nearly a decade before me. He was the one who showed me the ropes, so to speak, and gave me the lay of the land. Thomas was an odd man, quiet, stoic, and rarely willing to engage in conversation. But he had a certain wisdom to him, something you could only pick up from spending years in the company of the sea. Thomas wasn't much for small talk, but he often shared stories about the island and the things that had happened here long before I arrived. Most of these stories seem to be the kind of thing one tells when they've spent too many years alone in the wilderness. He spoke of the old keeper who had vanished mysteriously and the strange occurrences that had plagued the lighthouse in the past. But I brushed it off, thinking it was just the ramblings of a man who'd spent too much time in isolation. In the beginning, everything was just as it should be. I had no reason to think otherwise. My routine stayed the same, day in and day out. The same sounds, the same view, the same loneliness. Yet, there was something about the place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was as if the very air was charged with something, an energy that hung around me, even when I was alone, staring out over the cold expanse of the ocean. But nothing could have prepared me for the change. Something started to shift. It was subtle at first, just a fleeting moment here and there. A soft sound, a shiver that ran down my spine for no reason. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My mind tried to reason with me, trying to explain away the unease. The sea breeze, the isolation. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. The lighthouse was beginning to feel different. Still, life went on. Day after day, I kept the light burning, checked the equipment, and followed my routine. And for the time being, I convinced myself that it was all in my head. But then came the whispers from the sea. This was just the beginning, and as the days went on, I would find myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the world and the darkness that waits just beyond the horizon. It wasn't long after I had settled into the routine of lighthouse keeping that I began noticing the small, almost imperceptible shifts in my environment. At first, I told myself it was simply a product of my growing isolation, the silence amplifying the creaks of the old building, the wind pushing against the windows with a force that sometimes felt unnatural. But there were things I couldn't easily explain away, and they began to haunt me more and more. It all started one evening when I was sitting in the keeper's quarters, reading by the dim light of an oil lamp. The wind had picked up, howling through the cracks in the walls, and the sea roared angrily against the rocks below. It was an ordinary night, just like any other, but as I sat there, I began to notice something strange. The air felt heavier, as though something was pressing against me, suffocating the room. I attributed it to the rising storm outside, the kind that made the air thick with moisture. But then came the noise. It was faint at first, just a soft murmur, barely audible above the wind. I glanced around, wondering if I had imagined it. But it came again, clearer this time, a soft, almost melodic sound, like a voice carried by the wind. It didn't sound like any voice I had heard before, though. It wasn't human. It was more like a distant murmur, a blend of voices, all talking at once, too far away to make out individual words, but too distinct to be just the wind. I froze, my book forgotten in my hands. For a moment, I thought I was just tired, perhaps a little too worn out from the long days spent alone. But the sound continued, persistent and unsettling. It came from the sea, or at least that's what I believed. It seemed to originate from just beyond the lighthouse's reach, carried on the waves and the gusts of wind. I stood up slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck rising as I moved toward the window. Outside, the world was dark and wild. The storm had worsened, and the sea churned beneath a sky full of swirling clouds. I strained my ears, trying to hear the voices again, but all I could hear was the roar of the wind and the crashing waves. I waited, staring out into the abyss of the night, listening for any sign of the strange sound. It didn't come back. Shaking my head, I turned away from the window and went back to my chair, trying to convince myself that it was just a storm playing tricks on me. But even as I sat back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the room felt dense, like it was charged with static, and I couldn't stop glancing toward the door as if something were watching me. The night dragged on in an uncomfortable silence, and I eventually forced myself to sleep. But I didn't rest well. The dreams I had were fragmented and strange, filled with faces I couldn't recognize, all staring at me from the darkness. I woke up feeling more exhausted than I had when I went to bed, but I tried to push the unease out of my mind. I had a job to do, after all. The next morning, I went about my usual duties, tending to the light and checking the equipment. As I walked around the lighthouse, I noticed that the place seemed off. There was a faint smell of salt in the air, but not the fresh, clean scent of the sea that I was used to. This was different, stale and musty, as if the ocean itself had crept into the walls of the lighthouse, bringing something darker with it. I shrugged it off as just another oddity of living by the sea, but the discomfort lingered, settling deep in my chest. It wasn't long before the next strange event occurred. One afternoon, while I was cleaning the lantern room, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Thomas, the other keeper. He had been a bit more present lately, coming by every few days to check on me, make sure everything was running smoothly. But when I turned to greet him, the room was empty. I checked the hallways and the stairs, but no one was there. It was only then that I realized the footsteps had come from above me, from the tower itself. I felt my stomach tighten, a wave of unease washing over me. The tower was supposed to be locked when I wasn't up there, and I hadn't heard anyone coming in or out. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the wind had caused something to shift, or maybe I had just imagined it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I climbed up the stairs to the lantern room, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. As I reached the top, the air grew colder and a faint chill crept up my spine. The room was just as I had left it, no sign of anything amiss. But then I noticed something strange. One of the large lenses in the lantern was slightly askew, as though someone had been there, touching it. I hadn't touched it in days, and there was no reason for it to be out of place. My heart began to race, and I quickly checked the rest of the room, but there was nothing else that seemed unusual. That night, I locked the door to the tower and made sure everything was secure, but the feeling of unease refused to leave. The storm had passed, and the sky was clear, but the air felt thick with anticipation, as though something was waiting just outside, watching me from the shadows. I sat in the keeper's quarters that night, the silence pressing in on me. I kept my eyes on the window, watching the waves crash below, the moonlight dancing off the water's surface. The voices, the same ones I had heard before, seemed to come again, faint but clear, as if someone was calling from the sea. I stood up, unable to sit any longer, my heart pounding in my chest. I rushed to the window, staring out into the night, desperate for some explanation. But there was nothing. The sea stretched out before me, endless and dark. And yet, I could still hear those voices, whispering just beyond the reach of the lighthouse, calling to me in a language I couldn't understand. The strange events were beginning to pile up, one after another, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The lighthouse, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt like a prison. And I couldn't help but wonder if old Thomas had known about these things all along. If he had known what lay in wait just beyond the sea, waiting for someone like me to hear the call. The following days blended into a haze of constant vigilance. I tried to ignore the strange events, chalking them up to fatigue or the weather. But every time I thought about the eerie whispers or the phantom footsteps in the tower, a sense of dread crept up on me, settling in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. The nights became the hardest part. Every time I lay in my bed, just as my eyes began to close, the feeling of being watched would return, colder than before. It was as though the lighthouse itself had become an unwilling accomplice in some sinister plot. The weather didn't help. It had turned cold, the kind of cold that sunk into your bones and made every gust of wind feel like a slap in the face. The sea had turned restless again, with the waves crashing violently against the rocks beneath the lighthouse. There was an unsettling rhythm to it, the constant pounding of the surf that seemed to sync with the odd noises I had been hearing. I couldn't help but wonder if the ocean itself was trying to communicate with me, urging me to listen, to understand what it was trying to say. It was the third evening after the footsteps that things started to get even worse. I was down in the lower levels of the lighthouse, organizing the storage room, when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, but this time they weren't faint. They were deliberate, slow, echoing through the walls as if someone were walking just outside the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood frozen, listening intently. There was no wind outside to explain the noise, no natural reason for it. I glanced up at the door, the familiar wooden structure that separated me from the outside world, wondering if I should open it. But the thought of what I might find made my legs feel like lead. The footsteps stopped, but I wasn't alone in the room anymore. I could feel a presence, something cold and malevolent, watching me from the darkness. I quickly moved to the door and swung it open, fully expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. The hallway was as still as ever, the dim light from the lanterns casting long, eerie shadows across the stone floor. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and for a moment I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I stepped out into the hallway, my footsteps muted by the thick stone beneath me. The cold air seemed to press in from all directions, making my breath visible in the low light. I moved cautiously, slowly, toward the tower door. It was locked, just as I had left it. I tried the handle, testing it once more, but it didn't budge. Then I heard it again, the whispers, faint at first, but growing louder. The voices, just like before, distant and muffled, as if they were coming from beneath the earth, rising up from the very foundation of the lighthouse itself. My skin prickled, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The voices were becoming clearer, though still indecipherable, and I could feel my pulse quicken. It was as if they were calling to me, urging me to come closer, to understand their language, to join them in their mystery. The thought was absurd, but my mind was clouded, muddled with fear. I couldn't tear myself away. It was then that I made the decision to investigate. I couldn't stand it any longer, the uncertainty, the fear that had taken hold of me. I had to know what was going on. I had to understand whether my mind was playing tricks on me or if there was something more to these strange occurrences. So I grabbed the lantern and made my way back up the spiral staircase to the tower, my every step echoing off the stone walls. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but the tower was silent. As I reached the top, I felt that familiar chill again, the one that seemed to intensify every time I ventured into this part of the lighthouse. The air was dense, heavy with an energy I couldn't explain. I set the lantern on the floor and approached the lens, the very one I had noticed earlier, its glass gleaming in the dim light. It was still askew, but this time, something was different. There were smudges on the glass, faint and almost imperceptible, but they were there. I leaned in closer, studying them. They were in the shape of fingers, long and thin, as though someone had touched the glass with care, leaving a mark that felt out of place in this otherwise sterile environment. My fingers traced the edge of the mark, and as I did, I felt a sudden cold rush through me. The whispers returned, louder now, and for the first time, they sounded almost like they were inside my head, each word a distorted echo of something ancient and forgotten. I pulled my hand away from the lens and looked around the tower, searching for some sign of what had caused the disturbance. Nothing. The room was still, silent, except for the wind outside and the ominous whispers that seemed to swirl around me. My heart was racing, my breath shallow. I wanted to leave, to retreat back into the safety of the keeper's quarters, but something kept me rooted to the spot. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the room, barely visible in the shadows, something moved. It was subtle, just a flicker of movement, like a shadow passing in the corner of my eye. I spun around, my eyes wide, but when I looked toward the far wall, there was nothing there. I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or if something was truly happening, something I couldn't explain. The tower was empty, silent again, but the whispers, they were different now. They no longer sounded like distant voices carried by the wind. No, now they were here, right in front of me, too close to ignore. They were layered, overlapping, and growing in intensity. I stumbled back, the lantern shaking in my hand, and before I could process what was happening, I heard it clear as day, my name. Not in the soft, indistinct murmur of before, but spoken plainly, firmly, in a voice that chilled me to my very core. Come. I froze. The voice was not human. It didn't sound like any living being I had ever encountered. It was guttural, ancient, like the sound of the sea itself speaking in tongues I could never understand. I stood there, trapped in the tower, paralyzed by fear. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. The whispers were now a chorus of voices, a cacophony that filled the room, swirling around me like an unseen force. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape the tower. In that moment, everything inside me screamed to run. But my legs felt weak, my body frozen in place by an overwhelming force that I could neither see nor touch. It was as if the lighthouse itself had become a living thing, and it was drawing me in, pulling me towards something I could not comprehend. I finally managed to tear my eyes away from the shadows in the corner of the room. My hand reached for the door, and I stumbled toward it, the whispers still pressing against my ears, suffocating me. When I turned the handle and fled down the stairs, I could feel the walls closing in on me. The cold was unbearable, like the very air itself was trying to suffocate me, and the sea below seemed louder than ever. I don't know what I saw in that tower that night or what I heard. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I know the truth. There's something in that lighthouse, something ancient and powerful, and I'm not sure how much longer I can stay before it draws me in completely. The whispers are getting louder. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to leave the keeper's quarters. I had locked the door behind me and barricaded myself in, hoping that by staying away from the tower, I could escape whatever had been haunting me. But no matter where I went, no matter how much I tried to distance myself, the whispers followed. They were no longer coming from the sea. No, they had grown bolder, closer, louder, as if they had claimed the lighthouse as their own. The weather had taken a turn for the worse too. Dark clouds had rolled in, casting the lighthouse in a gloom that only deepened the sense of isolation. The wind howled through the cracks of the building, rattling the windows, and the sea roared beneath the cliffs, as though in violent protest of whatever was unfolding within the walls of the lighthouse. That afternoon, as I sat by the small fireplace in the keeper's quarters, I noticed something strange. The air had grown colder still, so much so that my breath formed visible clouds in front of me. I wasn't sure if it was the storm outside or something else, something more sinister, but the chill was different now, biting and unnatural, like a presence was lingering just beyond the walls. It was then that I heard the knock. At first, it was soft, almost as if it was being made by the wind. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. A firm knock that echoed through the quarters, and for a moment I wondered if it was someone at the door. I hadn't seen anyone for days, and the thought of another living person nearby felt like a fleeting comfort, even if it was an unlikely scenario. My heartbeat quickened as I slowly stood, cautiously approaching the door, every instinct telling me to stay put, to ignore it. But the knock came again, this time harder. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling. I didn't want to open it. I was sure it would be another unsettling moment, another reminder that this lighthouse was no longer just a building, but a living thing, holding something dark within it. Still, I pulled the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one. Just the empty hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and silent, with nothing but the echoes of my own breath. I stepped outside, scanning the area for any sign of life, but the hallway remained unchanged, as still as it had been before. I swallowed hard, wondering if I had imagined it, if the isolation and exhaustion had finally taken their toll on my mind. And that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just past the stairs leading up to the tower, a figure stood. It was impossible to make out any clear details at first, only a vague silhouette in the dim light. The figure was tall and shadowy, outlined by the flickering lanterns that barely illuminated the corridor. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I froze, my blood running cold. Every part of me wanted to run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the apparition, my legs refusing to move. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light, a shadow, or something far worse. But as I stared into the darkness, I felt the overwhelming sense that this thing wasn't just standing there. It was waiting for me. I called out, my voice shaky and weak. "Is someone there?" No answer. The figure remained motionless. I took a cautious step forward, each movement slow, deliberate. My breath came in shallow bursts, my heart thudding loudly in my chest. I had no idea what I was doing. Every part of me screamed to retreat, to lock myself away and never look back. But some force within me urged me to move closer. I had to know what it was. I had to see it for myself. As I stepped closer, the figure remained still, but the temperature in the hallway dropped further. I could feel the icy tendrils of fear creeping through my body, numbing me from the inside out. I gripped the lantern tighter, its weak light flickering in the growing cold. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It wasn't a smooth, natural movement. No, it was jerky, almost mechanical, as if it was struggling to maintain its form. It started to glide toward me, slow but inevitable, and I could feel the air around me shift, growing dense, suffocating. The whispers began again, louder now, but this time they weren't distant. They were right next to me, inside my head, swirling and pressing against my thoughts. "Come closer," the voice hissed, and it wasn't just one voice anymore. It was a chorus, a disjointed cacophony that filled the hallway, each voice layered over the other, speaking in unison. I felt the cold, the dread, surge within me, and for a moment I didn't know if I was dreaming, if I was still trapped in a nightmare. But the figure was real. I could see it now, clearer than before, its eyes, empty and hollow, fixed on me with a stare that could pierce through the very core of my soul. Its body was made of shadow and mist, a twisted amalgamation of what could have once been human, now corrupted by something far darker. My body shook as I took another step back, the whispers becoming clearer, more urgent. The voices were almost screaming now, demanding something I couldn't understand, urging me to come closer, to listen. In that moment, something inside me broke. The terror I had felt before, while unsettling, was nothing compared to the overwhelming, paralyzing fear I was now experiencing. My legs gave out beneath me, and I fell to my knees, the lantern slipping from my hand and rolling across the floor, casting erratic shadows against the stone walls. "Please," I whispered, though I didn't even know what I was begging for. "What do you want from me?" The figure stopped moving, and for a brief second, everything went silent. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from every corner of the lighthouse, a single word resonated through my mind. "Leave!" The air in the hallway grew heavier, pressing against me, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only focus on the figure before me. It was so close now, so close I could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that burned deeper than any winter wind could ever reach. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body wouldn't obey me. And then, as if in response to my desperate plea for release, the figure began to dissolve. Slowly, it faded into the air, the dark shadows dissipating into the nothingness from which it had emerged. The cold didn't fade with it, though. No, the air still pressed against me, thick and heavy, as though the thing had left an imprint on the very walls of the lighthouse. The whispers died down, but the feeling of being watched remained. I lay there on the cold stone floor for what felt like an eternity, struggling to regain control of my breath, my body. My hands trembled as I pushed myself up, my mind racing, still unable to process what had just happened. The figure, the voices, it had all been real, hadn't it? There was no denying it now. Something was inside the lighthouse, something ancient, something that had been here long before I had ever stepped foot on these cliffs. And as I stood there, in that dark hallway, I knew one thing for certain. I could no longer stay. The lighthouse wasn't just haunted by ghosts of the past. No, it was alive. And whatever was inside it wasn't done with me yet. I ran. The lighthouse door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the night like a final, decisive blow. My legs burned as I sprinted down the narrow path toward the cliff's edge, but I didn't dare slow down. I couldn't afford to stop. The air, thick with the remnants of that oppressive presence, seemed to claw at me, pulling me back toward the lighthouse. I had barely made it a few steps away when I heard a low, guttural sound, like something ancient and angry, rising from deep within the stone walls of the tower. It wasn't a voice this time. It was a growl, a sound born from the depths of something that had been sleeping for far too long. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in ragged bursts, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. The figure, the whispers, the overwhelming sense of being surrounded by something otherworldly, it was too much to process all at once. I wanted to run far away, as far as I could get, but the road leading down from the lighthouse was treacherous. One misstep, and I'd fall over the edge, straight into the cold, churning waters below. The storm had grown more intense by the minute, the wind howling like a pack of wolves eager to tear everything apart. I kept moving, my legs almost giving out beneath me as I neared the small boat dock at the bottom of the cliffs. The boat I'd used to reach the lighthouse was still tethered to its mooring post, though I had no intention of using it again. The last thing I wanted was to be on the water, surrounded by nothing but darkness and the unyielding grip of that unnatural cold. As I reached the dock, my thoughts raced, my mind bouncing from one fragmented image to the next, the hollow eyes of the shadowy figure, the voices in my head, the chilling air that had pressed down on me like a vice. I had to leave. I couldn't stay any longer, not after what I'd seen, not after what I had felt. But even as I turned to run back to the main road, something stopped me. A feeling I couldn't shake, a pull deep in my gut, telling me to go back. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something worse, something primal, something that made me feel like I had to go back to the lighthouse to face whatever was waiting there. But what was waiting for me? Was it the figure? Or was it something else entirely, something that would make me wish I'd never set foot in that cursed place? I didn't know, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I had unfinished business with the lighthouse. Something was still calling me, tugging at the edges of my mind, whispering to me from just out of reach. The longer I stood there, the stronger the pull became. I fought against it. I tried to push it out of my mind, tried to force myself to walk away, but it was like the very ground beneath me was shifting, urging me back. I couldn't ignore it anymore. With a heavy heart and a shaking hand, I turned around and made my way back to the lighthouse. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what I was going to find. All I knew was that I couldn't leave. Not yet. The wind had died down by the time I reached the base of the lighthouse again. The storm had passed, but the air still felt thick, unnaturally still. The silence was deafening, and the very stillness of the night seemed to weigh on me like 1,000 pounds. I approached the door cautiously, my heart pounding with each step. The door, which I had slammed shut in my haste earlier, was ajar now, slightly open, as if inviting me in. Against every instinct in my body, I stepped inside. The light from the lantern flickered weakly on the far side of the room, casting long, ghostly shadows on the walls. The air was colder here, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as I entered the tower. Every footstep echoed like a drumbeat, reverberating through the empty space, and with each echo, I felt the weight of the presence within the lighthouse grow heavier. I moved slowly, hesitating at every turn. The corridor was dark now, darker than I remembered. The whispers had started up again, faint and far off, like a distant hum that I couldn't place. But this time, the voices didn't scare me. They felt familiar, as though they were waiting for me. It was as if the tower itself was calling me, urging me deeper, and this time I couldn't resist. I had to know what it wanted from me. I reached the stairs that led up to the lantern room, the highest point of the lighthouse, and for the first time since arriving, I felt a flicker of dread. There, at the top of the stairs, I could just make out a figure. It was taller than before, more solid, but still made of shadow, as if the darkness itself had taken form. The figure turned slowly, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. "Leave," it whispered in the same chilling voice I had heard earlier. Only this time, the words didn't echo in my mind. They were spoken aloud, clear and deliberate. I could feel them in my chest, vibrating through me, as if the words themselves were trying to tear me apart. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by its gaze, by the overwhelming presence of whatever it was. "Why are you here?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out, its shadowy hand extending toward me, the tips of its fingers stretching, almost impossibly long. I felt the cold seep into my skin, the ice-cold fingers brushing against my own, and I gasped, pulling back, desperate to escape. But there was nowhere to go. In that moment, I understood. The lighthouse wasn't just haunted. It was a prison, and I had walked straight into its grasp. The shadows closed in, and I felt my breath freeze in my chest. My legs gave way, and I crumpled to the ground. The figure loomed over me, its eyes empty, its presence suffocating. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The air shifted, the weight lifted, and for a split second, I was alone again. The whispers stopped, the cold receded, and the lighthouse, once again, became just a lighthouse, empty and silent. I lay there, trembling, unsure of what had just happened. The terror still clung to me, but the presence was gone, leaving only the quiet, oppressive stillness. I had no answers, no explanation for what had just occurred. I stumbled to my feet, my mind spinning, and without another thought, I bolted out of the lighthouse and back down the cliffside, the wind rushing past me as I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the small village below, where I found myself standing, gasping for breath, staring back at the silhouette of the lighthouse in the distance. The lighthouse still stood there, as tall and imposing as it ever had been. But now it felt different. It didn't just sit at the edge of the world anymore. It was watching, waiting. The voices were gone, but I knew they would return. The presence wouldn't let me forget. I had encountered something in that lighthouse, something dark and ancient. And though I had left, I couldn't escape it. The lighthouse had marked me. The lighthouse loomed in my thoughts long after I had escaped its grasp, casting a shadow over my days and nights. There was a deep, gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach, a question that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried to move on. What had I truly encountered up there? What had I felt in the depths of that lighthouse? Was it just my mind unraveling under the pressure of isolation and fear? Or was there something else in that tower, something ancient, something waiting? The village below had returned to its normal rhythm, its quiet days blending into one another, but I couldn't seem to shake the sensation that something lingered behind, watching from the periphery. My encounters had not been forgotten. Even when I tried to focus on more mundane tasks, like talking to the townspeople or getting my bearings straight, the feeling that I was being watched never fully faded. I often caught myself glancing back toward the lighthouse, wondering if it was still waiting for someone else to step into its domain. Or worse, if it was still waiting for me. And slowly, I began to accept the fact that I may never understand what happened at the lighthouse. Maybe some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Maybe some things were too dark, too old, to be understood by the human mind. The village folk still spoke of the lighthouse, but their words were full of reverence, not fear. It was just part of the landscape to them, a fixture in their lives, like the sea itself. They had no idea of the horrors I had faced, or perhaps they had long since learned to ignore the eerie whispers that could sometimes be heard late at night. They had learned to live with it, but I knew I could never forget. I found myself looking for answers in places I never thought I would: books on local legends, historical records, even tales from the village's oldest residents. What I found was more unsettling than comforting. The lighthouse wasn't a recent construction. It had been standing there for centuries, and the stories told about it, passed down through generations, were filled with strange events and disappearances, with figures that seemed to emerge from the very darkness itself. People had disappeared, leaving only traces of their existence behind. Some had claimed to have seen figures standing on the cliffs, their faces obscured, staring out into the vast, empty sea. Others spoke of odd, ghostly figures that moved between the cracks of the lighthouse, only visible for a brief second before vanishing into thin air. But what struck me the most was an old, tattered journal I had found in the town's small library. It belonged to a previous keeper of the lighthouse, written many years ago. The journal entries, filled with paranoia and fragmented thoughts, detailed strange occurrences that began shortly after the keeper arrived. The keeper had written of whispering voices that came with a rising tide, of shadows that crept along the lighthouse walls, and of something or someone calling out from the sea in the dead of night. As the journal progressed, the keeper's handwriting became more erratic, the words harder to read. The last entry was almost illegible, but it mentioned something about the call and how it never stopped, no matter how far they ran. The final line was chilling. They come for those who listen. I've heard them, and now I cannot escape. That was the last I saw of the journal before it was taken from me. But the words had already burrowed their way deep into my mind. The more I thought about them, the more the pieces of my own experience began to align. The whispers I'd heard, those strange calls, like they were coming from the sea itself, were they the same ones the keeper had written about? The presence that had followed me, that strange pull toward the lighthouse, could it have been the same thing that haunted the keeper all those years ago? I knew then that I had to leave. I had to walk away from this place, from the memories, from the echoes of the voices. But the more I tried to convince myself to leave, the more I realized something. I wasn't the only one who had been affected by the lighthouse. There were others, people who had come to the village looking for something, but who never quite left. It was as if the lighthouse had sunk its claws into them, leaving a mark that was impossible to erase. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of those who were never the same after visiting. The ones who had left, but still couldn't escape the haunting memories. And I began to wonder, would I, too, be marked forever? Would I be bound to this place, to the lighthouse, as though it had claimed me? I spent the next few months trying to move on, trying to rebuild some semblance of normalcy. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows from the tower. Every time I passed by the cliffs, I felt the presence of something watching me. I couldn't shake it. One night, after months of restless sleep, I found myself standing by the cliffs again, staring at the lighthouse. The fog had rolled in, thick and suffocating. The air was damp, and the salty breeze stung my skin. I wasn't sure what I was doing there, whether it was out of some deep sense of guilt or a need to face whatever had been haunting me, but I found myself looking at the lighthouse once again. Its silhouette was barely visible, but I knew it was there. I could feel it. And then I heard it just as I had the first night. The whisper. Faint at first, but unmistakable. It was calling me. But this time, I didn't turn back. I stood there, on the edge of the cliffs, staring into the abyss. I couldn't go back to the lighthouse. Not again. But the voices, they had marked me. There was no running from them, no escaping what had already happened. I didn't know what the lighthouse wanted, what it was asking of me, but I had already been drawn into its pull. And so, I leave you with this, my friends. Some places are not just haunted by the past. Some places are alive with a presence that stretches far beyond time. If you ever find yourself near the sea, near a lighthouse, standing tall against the crashing waves, know this, there's something out there, watching, waiting. It calls to those who listen, and once it has your attention, it will never let go. It was a night just like any other. The kind of evening where the hum of the aircraft engines blended with the soft chatter of crew members preparing for a routine flight. I had been flying for years, working as a commercial airline pilot for a well-known carrier, and I thought I had seen it all. But that night, everything changed. The cockpit was calm. The dashboard lights glowed a faint orange, and the gentle hum of the aircraft's engines filled the silence. Outside, the dark sky stretched endlessly, dotted only by the occasional twinkling of distant stars. A standard late-night flight from one bustling city to another, carrying a mix of business travelers and families. As usual, the flight attendants were doing their rounds, and I was conversing with my co-pilot, discussing the usual minor details, weather reports, flight path adjustments, anything to pass the time. At first, everything felt normal. The world outside the cockpit window was the usual blend of blackness and occasional flashes of city lights far below. The low, steady hum of the airplane's engine created a sense of peace, a sense of security, the kind of atmosphere that had me feeling comfortable in my seat after so many years of service. I had always found peace in the air. There's something about it, the quiet, the focus, the solitude of being up above the world that brings a kind of clarity. But on this night, something about the air felt different. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there was a subtle change. An unexplainable tension, like static electricity in the air, waiting to release. And then came the first strange sighting. It was subtle at first, something that could easily have been written off as a trick of the eyes. But as I stared out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, moving in ways that didn't make sense. A faint light, too bright and too erratic to be another aircraft, caught my attention. It wasn't flashing like an airplane's beacon or the soft glow of a star. It was moving, but not in a predictable way. It danced, then darted away faster than any plane could. I turned to my co-pilot, but before I could say anything, the light disappeared into the dark expanse of the night. I blinked, wondering if I had just imagined it. "Did you see that?" I asked, a slight tremor in my voice, but my co-pilot didn't respond immediately. He had his eyes on the instrument panel, double-checking our altitude. He didn't seem to have noticed anything unusual. There was something out there, a light, bright, moving. He looked up for a moment, squinting into the inky darkness outside. "I didn't see anything," he said, sounding a little puzzled but unconcerned. "Probably a satellite or something. It happens. You're just tired, that's all." But I couldn't shake the feeling. The sensation lingered in my gut, a knot tightening with each passing minute. The logical part of my mind told me to forget about it. There were 1,000 things that could explain what I saw. But a strange part of me, one that had been buried beneath years of professional calm and routine, felt a sense of unease creeping in. Something was out there, and I was not ready for what would come next. Later, as we cruised at 35,000 feet, I began to notice more irregularities. A flicker in the instruments, a slight dip in altitude that we hadn't accounted for. My co-pilot adjusted the controls, but there was something in his movements that felt deliberate. He was trying to hide something. I could tell. His eyes flicked to the radar screen, then back out the window. His hands moved with precision, but they were a little too fast, too sharp, like he was trying to keep something under control. For a moment, I wasn't sure whether I should confront him. But then, just as quickly, it passed, and I told myself it was nothing, just the pressures of a long shift. However, the strange feeling only grew. It wasn't the kind of discomfort you get when you're unsure of your surroundings. This felt different, something more primal, more unsettling. It was as if the world had momentarily shifted, and I was on the edge of discovering something that could never be explained. And that was just the beginning. What followed that night was far stranger, far more terrifying than anything I had encountered in my career. The lights outside the window grew brighter and more erratic, almost like they were deliberately avoiding our aircraft. At times, they would pace us, moving in patterns that defied any logical explanation. Suddenly, my mind began racing. The thought that had been hanging in the back of my mind was gaining momentum. What if it wasn't a trick of the eye? What if this wasn't just some satellite or space debris? What if we weren't alone in the sky? What if there were other things? Things that didn't belong? But no, that was impossible. This was real. This was me, a seasoned pilot with thousands of hours under my belt, trained to handle all sorts of situations. Still, the nagging question would not go away. The lights seemed too deliberate, too purposeful to be ignored. I couldn't keep pretending like I hadn't seen what I had seen. And that's when things started to get truly unsettling. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. I had already spent countless hours in the cockpit, flying this very route, but there was something different about tonight. It wasn't in the instruments, not yet. No mechanical malfunctions, no blaring alarms, nothing to suggest anything was amiss. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that the air itself felt heavier somehow, more oppressive. The first unsettling sign didn't come as a loud, jarring noise or a dramatic event. It came as something far subtler, a tiny anomaly, a flicker in the corner of my vision. It was easy to dismiss at first, just a fleeting moment that could have been explained away by tired eyes. But that flicker, that faint movement in the distance, lingered in my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. I had been flying for years, and the night sky had always been a constant companion. It had never felt foreign to me. But on this particular evening, the blackness outside felt different. The sky seemed deeper, as if it was pulling me into it, drawing me further away from the grounded reality I knew. At first, I thought it was just the stars, faint and scattered, as they often appeared in the night sky. But this light wasn't like the stars. It wasn't fixed in place. It moved gliding across the horizon with a grace that seemed unnatural. I leaned forward, squinting my eyes to make sure I wasn't imagining it. I glanced at the radar, which remained calm. The usual blips of traffic and satellites dotted the screen, but nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't take my eyes off the light. It seemed to be following us, maintaining a steady distance, but shifting positions erratically, almost like it was deliberately adjusting to our movements. "Hey, did you see that?" I asked my co-pilot, breaking the silence in a voice that I immediately regretted. He was sitting back in his chair, flipping through a flight manual, his eyes occasionally glancing over the instruments in front of us. At first, he didn't respond. I repeated myself a little more urgently this time. "Did you see that light?" He looked up from his reading, raising an eyebrow, but not showing any real concern. His eyes flicked toward the window for a moment, scanning the darkness outside. "What light?" "That one," I said, pointing toward the faint, moving glow. He peered outside again, but this time he was more distracted. The glow had vanished, fading into the blackness of the night. "It's probably just a satellite. Nothing to worry about." I tried to convince myself of that, but there was something in the way he said it. His tone was almost too dismissive, too casual for something that had seemed so deliberate. Still, I wasn't about to press it. It could very well have been a satellite or even an aircraft far off in the distance. The thing was, as I went back to focusing on the controls, I couldn't ignore that sense of something lurking just beyond the edge of perception. The tension remained, thick and palpable, like something was waiting to emerge. For the next few minutes, the flight continued smoothly. My mind wandered back to my routine tasks, checking flight paths, verifying fuel levels, and keeping an eye on the radar. But then, as I turned to speak with my co-pilot again, I caught something moving just out of the corner of my eye. This time, it was larger, brighter, more defined. A slow-moving, faintly glowing shape that seemed to grow larger as it approached. I couldn't help but feel my heart rate quicken, my breath catching in my throat. "Okay, that's not a satellite," I muttered under my breath. My co-pilot, who had been absent-mindedly flipping through his manual again, didn't seem to notice the intensity in my voice. He was busy, his head buried in paperwork, but something in my tone caught his attention. "All right, what's up?" he asked, finally turning his gaze out the window. I had expected him to dismiss it again, but this time his expression shifted. There was a noticeable pause as he stared into the dark expanse outside the cockpit. He leaned forward, squinting, trying to make out the shape. After a few long moments, he looked at me, his face now a mixture of confusion and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "I don't know. That doesn't look like anything I've ever seen." The light wasn't a conventional aircraft light. It wasn't even shaped like a traditional light. It was almost spherical, glowing with a strange, pale way. The edges of the light seemed to ripple, distorting in a way that wasn't natural. It didn't behave like anything we were familiar with. No satellite, no plane, no star. For a moment, we both just stared at it in silence, the hum of the engines filling the gap between us. It moved in a slow, deliberate pattern, shifting side to side, as if tracking our movements. But what struck me most was how fast it seemed to change directions, almost impossibly fast. It would dart one way, then instantly veer in another direction, keeping a steady pace with our aircraft. "Should we report this?" I asked, finally breaking the silence. My voice was tighter now, a slight quiver betraying the nervousness I was trying to suppress. "Report what?" he replied, sounding a bit incredulous. "There's nothing to report. We don't even know what it is." But even as he spoke, I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't as calm as he tried to sound. I turned back to the controls, my mind racing. It was rare that anything unexplainable happened during flights. Most of the time, you could always attribute oddities to something logical, something grounded in the real world. But this wasn't something I could easily explain away. I could feel it, the growing unease in my stomach, the feeling that something was terribly, terribly off. I glanced again at the radar, searching for something, anything that could explain what we were seeing. There was nothing. The readings remained normal. No unusual blips, no strange interference. Just the vast, empty stretch of sky. The light, too, seemed to stay in its place, just out of reach, maintaining its distance, but never breaking off completely. It was like it knew we were watching it, and it refused to let us look away. For a while, neither of us said much more. My co-pilot returned to the radar, fiddling with the settings, but his focus was off, his movements jerky. He kept glancing back at the window, as if he couldn't help but wonder what we were seeing. And then, without warning, the light flickered out. It was gone. Just like that. But the unease didn't disappear. No, if anything, the absence of the light made the silence feel worse. It was as if the strange, erratic behavior we had witnessed had left a void, a nagging, oppressive feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Do you think it was an aircraft?" I asked, still staring out the window. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let out a low breath, pushing his chair back and standing up. Could have been anything. We both fell quiet again, both of us unwilling to admit what was really on our minds. In that moment, as we flew through the night sky, I could feel something change in the air. The world outside the cockpit had gone eerily still, and I had the strangest sensation that I wasn't entirely alone. Something was out there with us, something that didn't belong. The silence that followed the vanishing of the strange light was unsettling in its own right. For the first time in my career as a pilot, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The hum of the engines, the whirring of the controls, and the dull click of the autopilot, everything felt far too loud now, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I kept my hands on the controls, but my thoughts were elsewhere, drifting in a sea of unease. The next few hours seemed to stretch into eternity, a quiet, tense passage of time. My co-pilot and I exchanged glances occasionally, but neither of us spoke much. We were both waiting for something to break the tension, yet neither of us dared to acknowledge the strange event we'd witnessed. I kept telling myself that it had been nothing more than a trick of the eye, a fleeting moment of confusion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The light, the thing that had moved with such deliberate precision, the way it had flickered out of existence, kept playing in my mind. There was no explanation that seemed adequate, no logic that fit. And as time passed, I began to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. But then the next event happened. It wasn't much at first, just another flicker, this time in the radar. A small blip, a pulse of static that wasn't supposed to be there. It was subtle enough that I almost dismissed it, convinced it was just some odd electrical interference. But it lingered, growing more erratic by the minute, as if something was moving just out of reach of the radar's grasp. I tapped the screen, trying to get it to recalibrate, but the strange pulse didn't stop. Instead, it intensified, growing stronger with every passing moment. "What the hell is that?" my co-pilot muttered, his voice sharp now, betraying his mounting concern. I glanced over at the radar again, trying to make sense of it. The blip was still there, though now it seemed to be getting closer, moving with alarming speed. Whatever it wasn't a conventional aircraft. It was too erratic, shifting directions too quickly for any normal flight path. I tried to adjust the radar settings, but nothing worked. The interference continued, like a pulse of static clinging to the edges of our instruments. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a sense of foreboding crawling up my spine. "I think it's time we report this," I said, though I was unsure what I would even say. A strange pulse of static in the radar, a flickering light in the distance. But before I could finish, the blip vanished just as suddenly as it had appeared. "What the hell?" My co-pilot stared at the radar, now dead silent. It was as though the pulse had never existed, leaving nothing behind but the eerie quiet of the cockpit. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced back out the window, half expecting to see that strange light again. But the sky was as still as ever, the stars twinkling far in the distance, offering no comfort. The next few hours passed in a blur. The air was thick with tension, but we both knew better than to let it show. We focused on our tasks, eyes darting to the instruments every now and then, the ever-present hum of the engines like a reminder of how fragile our existence in this vast, unfeeling sky really was. Then, something changed again this time. It wasn't subtle at all. We were cruising at 30,000 feet, heading toward our next waypoint, when the plane suddenly jolted. Not a gentle shake or a shift in altitude, but a sharp, violent lurch. It felt like the world itself had bucked beneath us, a violent tremor that rattled through the aircraft. I quickly gripped the controls, bracing for a possible malfunction or turbulence, but there was nothing on the instruments to suggest a problem. No warning lights. No changes in speed or altitude. "What the hell?" my co-pilot whispered under his breath, eyes wide. I glanced at the window, half expecting to see something outside. But all I could see was the inky expanse of the night sky. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The plane settled into its usual glide, as though nothing had happened. But it was enough to rattle us both, the quiet aftershock echoing in the pit of my stomach. We remained silent for a long time, each of us deep in thought, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. "I don't like this," my co-pilot finally said, breaking the silence. I didn't like it either. Whatever was happening, whatever had been happening, it was escalating. The strange lights, the interference in the radar, and now this violent jolt. The feeling that we weren't alone, that something we couldn't understand was out there, was growing stronger with each passing minute. We decided to make a brief check of the aircraft systems. We ran through the standard procedures, confirming that everything was functioning as it should. No engine malfunctions, no fuel problems. Everything was normal. Yet, the longer we spent going through the motions of the checklist, the more I realized that it was just a distraction. We were checking the systems. Yes, but what about the things that couldn't be measured? The strange, inexplicable feelings creeping up on us? By the time we finished our checks, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was out there, something not bound by the rules of aviation or physics. Something that didn't belong in the sky. I turned to my co-pilot, my voice steady, but my heart racing. "We need to figure out what's going on. We can't just ignore this." He nodded, his jaw clenched tight. He had been trying to keep it together, but it was clear he was just as rattled as I was. We both knew that ignoring this was no longer an option. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop until we faced it head on. We decided to change course, to circle back and see if we could track down the source of the strange light, the mysterious blip on the radar. If it was an aircraft, we might be able to make contact. If it was something else, well, we didn't want to think about that just yet. As we began to adjust our flight path, I felt the plane shift beneath us, as if the air had thickened. The atmosphere seemed to change again, becoming oppressive, heavier. It was as though the world outside the cockpit had become a different place, a place where the laws of physics didn't apply. I glanced at the radar again. The strange pulse had returned. This time, it was larger, stronger, almost like a presence pushing against the edges of the screen. I watched, transfixed, as it seemed to grow closer with every passing second. I could hear my co-pilot muttering something under his breath, but I couldn't focus on anything except the radar. The pulse was almost right on top of us now. And then, without warning, the static increased, the screen flickering violently before cutting out entirely. "Shit," I whispered, but the words barely escaped my mouth before the entire cockpit was plunged into darkness. The instruments had gone dead. No lights, no radar, no nothing. The only thing that remained was the eerie hum of the engines, a sound that seemed distant and hollow now, as if the plane was drifting through some uncharted void. "Power failure?" my co-pilot asked, his voice tight with anxiety. I checked the power systems. Everything was functioning. Everything should have been normal. But it wasn't. Nothing was normal anymore. Then, just as quickly as the darkness had descended, the lights came back on. The instruments flickered to life, the radar now showing a single, massive blip directly ahead. And just like that, I knew. We weren't alone anymore. Something was out there. Something that couldn't be explained. Something that defied everything we knew. And it was coming for us. The lights flickered one more time, briefly plunging us back into darkness before the cockpit lit up again. The radar was no longer showing a mere blip. It was a solid, overwhelming mass, filling the screen entirely. It wasn't moving in any pattern I could make sense of. It just was. It was as if something enormous had appeared out of nowhere, casting a shadow over our flight path, as though the very air had thickened and was now pushing against us. I sat frozen, my eyes glued to the screen, heart hammering in my chest. The quiet hum of the engines felt strangely hollow, far away, almost as if the world outside the cockpit no longer existed. "Did you see that?" my co-pilot whispered, his voice barely audible. I turned to look at him, but his face was pale, eyes wide in shock. He was staring at the radar, as though willing it to give some explanation, but the mass on the screen remained, a solid black hole of interference. It wasn't an aircraft. I could see that much. No conventional craft could cause this kind of disruption, this kind of presence. Then, a sound, a low, metallic groan rippled through the air, coming from somewhere beyond the plane. Something that was too close, too wrong. It was like the world itself had shifted, bending under some invisible weight, making the metal frame of the plane squeal as if under immense pressure. The sound wasn't like turbulence. It was something else. Something I had never heard before in my entire career. And then, a flash, a single, bright, white light burst from the darkness ahead of us, so intense that I had to shield my eyes. It wasn't a typical lightning strike. It didn't flicker, it didn't crackle, it simply was. And in that instant, the entire cockpit was bathed in blinding light, as though the very air was charged with electricity. I slammed my hands onto the controls, trying to maintain control, but the aircraft began to shudder violently. The light enveloped us, and the plane seemed to be lifted off its flight path, suspended for a brief moment in the air, as if some unseen force was manipulating its every movement. "Hold on," I shouted, but my voice seemed so insignificant, so small, swallowed by the unnatural force surrounding us. The instruments went haywire, the once familiar dials and screens now flashing wildly with erratic readings. The altitude indicator spun out of control, and the airspeed dial jumped in unpredictable bursts. My hands were trembling as I fought to regain control, to stabilize the plane, but nothing felt real anymore. Everything seemed distorted, both inside the cockpit and beyond. Then, the light vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the sickening aftertaste of disorientation behind. The plane lurched again, a force so violent that I was thrown back into my seat. My co-pilot grabbed onto the armrest, his knuckles white, but he didn't say a word. He couldn't. The silence that followed was unbearable, thick with tension and fear. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was terrified that if I did, the spell would break, and whatever was out there would hear me. And I was certain, deep in my bones, that something was out there. I could see my co-pilot breathing heavily, trying to steady himself. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of disbelief and terror. I couldn't blame him. I was feeling the same way, only I was too afraid to let it show. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the engine seemed louder now, but everything else had gone completely still. The turbulence had stopped. The lights remained steady, and the radar was still showing that massive shape ahead of us. We weren't alone. Whatever that was on the radar, it was there. And it wasn't moving away. It was just waiting. "We need to get out of here," my co-pilot muttered, his voice tight with panic. I turned my attention back to the instruments. But no matter what I did, the plane was still locked into its current course, drawn to whatever that presence was, like a moth to a flame. There was no way to divert course. It was as if something beyond us, something far greater than anything we could comprehend, was guiding us, or trapping us. "Look!" my co-pilot shouted suddenly, his voice breaking through the tension. I turned to follow his gaze, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flash of movement, a figure, a shape, just outside the window. At first, it was only a blur, a distortion in the air that flickered and vanished before my eyes could fully process it. But then it appeared again, and this time I saw it more clearly. A figure floating in the air. Not a person, not a being of any kind I could identify, but something else entirely. It wasn't solid, but translucent, a shimmering form that seemed to be made of light and shadow, shifting unnaturally, distorting in ways that no living creature should be able to. It was hovering in the air beside the plane, almost as though it was observing us. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me was screaming at me to look away. The figure was watching us. It wasn't just there, it was aware. I could feel it deep in my gut, that cold sense of knowing that we were no longer the ones in control, that we were the ones being observed. I could hear my co-pilot whispering frantically to himself, but his words were lost to the mounting roar in my ears. The figure outside the window didn't move closer, didn't make any threatening gestures. It simply floated there, suspended in midair, a presence that defied everything I knew about the laws of physics. But it wasn't the figure itself that terrified me. It was the realization that I had no control over this situation. That whatever was happening to us was beyond our understanding, beyond anything I had ever prepared for. I had flown through countless storms, encountered turbulence that rattled the plane, but nothing had ever felt like this. Nothing had ever made me feel so small, so powerless. "Get on the radio," I managed to force out, my voice barely a whisper. "We need help." But my co-pilot was already trying. He was frantically switching between frequencies, attempting to reach air traffic control, but the radio remained silent. There was no response, no signal. It was as if the world outside our plane had gone mute. The figure continued to hover beside us, closer now, its form swirling in the air, as though it was becoming more solid, more present. I felt my pulse quicken as the pressure in the cockpit grew heavier, the air thick with an unnatural energy. I didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but I knew that we were no longer in control of our fate. "We need to do something," my co-pilot urged, his voice cracking. I nodded, but what could we do? I had no answers, no solutions. We were just two men, drifting helplessly through the night sky, at the mercy of forces far beyond our comprehension. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to dissolve, breaking apart in flashes of light, like a glitch in the air itself. It twisted and flickered, and then, just as quickly as it had arrived, it vanished, leaving only an empty sky behind. The silence was deafening. For a long moment, neither of us moved. We were still processing what had just happened, still grappling with the image of that impossible, unearthly figure that had been right outside our window. But it wasn't over. No, that moment was only the beginning. What had happened was just a taste of something far larger, far darker, something that had only just begun to show itself. And whatever it was, we were still in its grip. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The moments after the figure disappeared were unlike anything I had ever experienced. There was a profound silence, not just in the cockpit, but in the world itself. I sat there, my hands frozen on the controls, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought we might have escaped it. That whatever it was had decided to leave us, had moved on to another place. But even in that fleeting sense of relief, I knew better. "We're not safe," I murmured, almost to myself. The words left my mouth without thought, but as soon as they did, I knew they were true. We hadn't escaped. This was far from over. My co-pilot didn't answer. He was staring out the window, his face pale, as though he was still searching for the figure that had vanished. I turned to look at him, and I could see the tremble in his hands, the wide, horrified look in his eyes. Whatever had happened out there had shaken him to his core. He wasn't the kind of man to spook easily. I had seen him face storms, technical failures, and even emergency landings without flinching. But this was different. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came out. His gaze shifted back to the radar screen, still showing the massive black shape ahead of us. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the screen, but I could see the same fear in them, the same realization that had started to settle over me. It was still there, the massive presence. It had never left. Suddenly, the air in the cockpit felt thick. The temperature seemed to drop, and for the first time, I noticed a faint buzzing sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a low hum, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. It vibrated through the metal walls of the plane, the very bones of the aircraft itself. The radar began to shift again, the once stable lines warping, the blips growing larger, more erratic. I tried to reset the instruments to clear away the static, but nothing worked. It was as though the entire system was being overridden by something far beyond anything I could comprehend. "Why is it still there?" my co-pilot finally whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know how to explain what was happening. All I knew was that we were still being pulled towards something. A force. A presence. It wasn't just on the radar, it was in the air itself, in the very fabric of the atmosphere surrounding us. I could feel it now. A strange, tingling sensation in my fingertips, a weight pressing down on my chest. The very air felt thick, charged, as though the entire sky had become one massive, oppressive force. It was as though the world outside the plane was bending and warping, and we were being dragged into it. "We need to land," I said, my voice steady now, but with a hint of urgency. But even as I spoke the words, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. We weren't going to just fly out of this. We weren't going to outrun it. The force was closing in, faster than we could react. We were trapped in its pull, and I could feel the sense of dread rising again, sharper this time. No matter what we did, it was as if the world was conspiring against us. The plane itself seemed to be drawn toward that unseen presence, unable to break free. The radar beeped sharply again, a sudden spike in intensity that made both of us jump. I glanced at the screen and saw it was coming closer. The black shape was growing larger, filling the screen, pushing against the edges, expanding like some enormous, invisible object that had suddenly manifested out of the dark sky. And then, without warning, the lights flickered once more, plunging us into darkness. It was at that moment that I knew it wasn't going to stop. It wasn't going to let us go. Whatever was out there, whatever had pulled us into this nightmare, was in control. We were no longer in command. We were just passengers in a twisted, alien journey. And then, just as quickly as the darkness had descended, the lights returned. The radar went blank. The instruments were dead. The entire plane felt as though it had entered a vacuum, silent, motionless, as though time itself had stopped. We were falling. I could feel it. The sensation of weightlessness creeping in, the downward pull of gravity heavier than it had ever been before. The ground below us seemed to stretch endlessly, an abyss that we were plummeting toward. But in the midst of that descent, something changed. The humming sound grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the entire cabin. And then there was a voice, soft at first, but growing stronger. It wasn't a voice I recognized, and it wasn't a voice I could understand. It wasn't even a human voice. It was a sound, a language that seemed to reverberate in my mind more than in my ears. I couldn't place it, but it was like the very fabric of the universe was speaking directly to me. A flash of light, a wave of heat, and suddenly everything was still. The weightlessness was gone. The hum ceased. The radar flickered back on, showing only static, only the faintest trace of a presence, nothing like before. But we were no longer falling. The plane had leveled out, and I realized we had somehow survived. I sat back in my seat, panting, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. My co-pilot was silent, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the now blank screens in front of him. His hands were shaking, but he didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Nothing we could say would make sense of this. I don't know how long it took for the rest of the flight to pass. Time became a blur after that. We flew through the night, unsure of where we were, unsure of what had just occurred, unable to reach out for help. We had no answers. We had no explanation. And the worst part, we didn't even know if it was truly over. When we finally landed, hours later, our aircraft was checked for any malfunctions, any damage, but there was nothing. The plane was perfectly fine. Not a scratch. Not a single indication that anything out of the ordinary had happened. The engineers were puzzled, and they could see we were shaken, but they wrote it off as a technical glitch. But it wasn't a glitch. It wasn't just some anomaly. It was something else. Something that couldn't be explained by science or reason. Something that existed beyond the boundaries of what we understood. And as I sit here now, years later, I still don't have the answers. I still don't know what happened that night, what we saw, or who or what was out there watching us. All I know is that we are not alone. We were never alone. It wasn't just the skies that we needed to fear, it was what lurked beyond them. The questions remain unanswered, but the feeling, the knowledge that there are things out there beyond our comprehension never leaves me. And as for my co-pilot, well, he never flew again. I can't blame him. Some things are just too much for the human mind to process. Some experiences stay with you long after the lights have gone out. I remember the night it all started like it was yesterday. It was the middle of a long stretch of shifts at the call center. The kind of job that eats away at your time and your energy, but doesn't really leave much room for excitement. Working in a call center isn't glamorous, but it's steady. And sometimes, steady is enough. The office was typical for a place that worked round the clock. Fluorescent lights hummed in the background, a low, monotonous buzz that I often found myself tuning out. The constant ringing of phones felt like a distant echo, my coworkers and I so accustomed to it that it no longer registered as sound. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of coffee, recycled air, and the faint odor of carpet that hadn't seen a vacuum in ages. Everything in the office was gray, from the cubicles to the chairs to the carpet beneath our feet. It wasn't a place you went for comfort, but it was a place that kept the lights on. I wasn't alone in that office. There were a few of us, all working different shifts. On this particular night, it was just me and a few other night shift employees, though it felt like I was the only one awake. I had worked nights for a while, and the loneliness of it had started to settle in like a heavy weight. The only sounds in the office were the occasional tapping of keyboards, the steady click of a mouse, and the distant voices of customers on the other end of the line. But I wasn't just working the usual routine that night. There was something off about the atmosphere. It was the kind of feeling that presses down on your chest without you realizing it until it's too late. You know the feeling. It's the one where the silence feels wrong, like it's just too quiet, and you can't shake the thought that someone's watching you. But you tell yourself it's nothing, just the usual weariness from too many late nights. My name is Jason, and I've worked at the call center for the better part of a year. There's nothing particularly remarkable about me, except maybe my ability to deal with angry customers with a smile. That's what you need in a job like this: patience, persistence, and the ability to let the words slide off you without letting them get to your head. But by this point, after months of late nights and graveyard shifts, I had perfected the art of tuning out the usual customer complaints, focusing only on getting the job done. I was good at it, and I wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon. That night, though, things felt different. It was around midnight when it started: just me, my computer, and a headset on my head. The night was quiet, the usual buzz of voices and keyboard clicks interrupted only by the occasional ring of the phone. I took calls, processed complaints, tried to resolve issues for frustrated customers. It was a normal night, or so it seemed. But as the minutes stretched on, I couldn't help but feel that something was creeping into the atmosphere, something uninvited. The call center had recently gone through a system overhaul, and we were using new software to manage the calls. It was a bit of a mess, to be honest. Things were glitching left and right. That was the excuse I used to brush off the strange occurrences. Maybe the system was malfunctioning. Maybe I was just overthinking it, tired after a long shift. After all, working in a place like this meant you got used to glitches and technical hiccups. You just kept going, trying to push through it until your shift ended. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The soft flicker of the overhead lights didn't help, nor did the eerie silence that seemed to settle over the office as the minutes ticked by. Most of the others had gone home hours ago, leaving only a handful of us who worked into the early hours of the morning. The lonely hours of the night can do strange things to a person, I've learned. The stillness can make you jumpy, even when there's nothing there. I glanced over at the clock on the wall. It read 12:47 a.m. A long shift still ahead, and I was already feeling the drag. As I pushed the button to take the next call, I tried to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. Thank you for calling customer service. This is Jason. How can I help you tonight? I could hear the distant sound of breathing on the other end. The line crackled slightly, the voice on the other side unclear, muffled in a way that made it hard to understand. A strange thing to happen at this hour, but not completely unusual. Hello? I said, trying to get the person's attention. The breathing continued, slow and deliberate. I clicked the button to check the caller's information, but it was blank. No phone number, no account name, no details at all. The screen was completely empty. I felt my pulse quicken, a small shiver running up my spine. Is anyone there? I asked. my voice wavering just a little, despite my attempt to remain calm. But there was no answer, just the sound of Rag breathing, and then the line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, the empty screen glaring back at me. A cold chill ran through me. I told myself it was just a technical issue. After all, the system had been glitching all night. Maybe it was just some automated system or a wrong number. But something about the silence felt different, unsettling. I couldn't explain it. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the best of me. I'd been working too many hours, and I was probably just tired. That's all. I returned to my tasks, pushing the incident out of my mind. But in the back of my mind, the feeling lingered. The quiet, heavy atmosphere of the office pressing down on me. Then, just as I was about to settle back into my routine, the phone rang again. This time, there was no breathing, no static, no voice, just silence. But there was something different. The number on the display screen was disconnected. It was a number that no longer existed. That's when I knew something wasn't right. At first, I thought I had imagined it, the strange silence that came from the disconnected number. It could have been some glitch in the system, a random quirk or faulty technology. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, especially not at 1 o'clock, when I was already running on fumes and desperate for my shift to end. I had to keep going, though. I had bills to pay, and this job, as soul-crushing as it was, kept the lights on. My coworkers didn't seem bothered by the oddities of the night. It wasn't unusual for people to call in with incomplete information or for the system to behave erratically. No one in the office would bat an eye at an empty screen or a glitchy phone call. But something about this particular call bothered me. There was a sense of wrongness that I couldn't shake. The phone call from the disconnected number had been eerily different. There was no explanation for it, no way to rationalize it. My mind kept returning to it as I moved through the rest of my night. I glanced around the office, noticing that the lights above me flickered just a little more than usual. And for a moment, the hum of the fluorescent bulbs seemed louder than before. I shook my head, trying to push away the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Just another weird night, I muttered to myself. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I couldn't ignore the creeping sense of unease that continued to settle into my chest. The next few calls came and went without much incident. Customers needed their passwords reset, complaints had to be filed, and I did what I had done 1,000 times before. Yet, the memory of that strange call from the disconnected number lingered, a ghost in the back of my thoughts, refusing to leave. It wasn't long before the atmosphere in the office began to shift. The usual quiet of the night was punctuated by odd sounds, faint tapping, a distant rustling, and the unmistakable feeling of someone or something watching. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little jumpy. The night had already felt off, and now it was like the air itself had thickened, becoming heavier. I glanced around again, but there was no one else here, and the only sound was the rhythmic click of my mouse and the occasional hum of a phone. At about 2 o'clock, I found myself sitting alone in my cubicle, the glow of the computer screen the only light in the otherwise dark office. The others had gone home hours ago, and it was just me and the soft, constant buzzing of the office machinery. I should have been used to the isolation by now, but tonight felt different. The silence seemed too loud, as if the world outside had disappeared, leaving only me in this desolate space. Then, as if to validate my uneasy feeling, the phone rang again. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the receiver. A small part of me didn't want to answer it. What if it was another strange, disconnected call? But duty called. I had a job to do, and the calls had to be answered. I clicked the headset into place and greeted the caller. "Thank you for calling customer service. This is Jason. How can I help you tonight?" The call started as it always did, just the static of a line and the soft click as the customer came through. But this time, something was different. The air seemed to thicken again, and my heart began to race. There was no voice on the other end. For a brief moment, I thought I was dealing with another misdialed number. But then I heard it, a soft, raspy breathing. At first, it was faint, just barely audible over the line. I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me, a result of too many sleepless nights. But then the breathing grew louder, slow, steady, almost rhythmic, like the person on the other end was deliberately dragging their breath out. "Hello," I asked again, trying to stay calm. "Is anyone there?" Nothing. Just the sound of that slow, steady breathing. It felt like it was coming from right next to me, as if the person was standing just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts swirling in my mind. "If you're having trouble with the system, please let me know. I'm here to help." There was no response, just more breathing. Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone in disbelief, feeling the cold sweat start to form at the back of my neck. This wasn't normal. It couldn't be. Who would call, breathing into the phone, and not say a word? My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was just a prank. A wrong number. There were plenty of weirdos out there who enjoyed wasting other people's time. But this felt different. The air around me seemed colder, and the oppressive silence in the office made my skin crawl. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 2:18 a.m. The hours seemed to be stretching longer, the minutes dragging by like they had all the time in the world. I rubbed my face, trying to shake off the creeping dread that had settled over me. It was just my nerves, I told myself. I had to keep it together. But it wasn't just that one call. Over the next few minutes, the phone rang again, another call from the same disconnected number. I froze. My hand hovered over the receiver, torn between answering and ignoring it. But curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked the button to accept the call. Once again, the line was filled with the same eerie silence, followed by that ragged breathing. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the sound, but this time I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The call lasted for a few moments before the line went dead. I wanted to call someone. I wanted to tell someone that something was wrong, but there was no one left in the office, and everyone I knew was sound asleep by now. I was alone, completely and utterly alone. As the phone call ended, I felt an overwhelming urge to check the number on the display. But when I did, my stomach dropped. The number wasn't just disconnected. It was blank. There was no number at all. It was as if the call had come from nowhere, from a place that didn't exist. I stared at the screen, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something about it made me want to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my mind racing with questions, with fear, but unable to move. I did the only thing I could think of. I logged out of the system. I took my headset off and leaned back in my chair, trying to steady my breathing. I was thinking too much, I told myself. It was probably nothing. Maybe the system had malfunctioned. Maybe it was all just a weird glitch. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a glitch. Something strange, something unnerving was happening. The phone rang again. I stared at it, my hand still frozen above the receiver. The third call came not long after the second one. By now, I had convinced myself it was some kind of glitch. Maybe someone was playing a prank, or there was an issue with the phone lines. Maybe it was just some bizarre thing that had happened in the system. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air around me felt colder, denser, and the flickering of the fluorescent lights overhead didn't help matters. Every minute seemed to stretch on longer than the last. As the phone rang, I hesitated. Should I answer? Should I just ignore it? But there it was again, the same disconnected number, the same blank space on the display, and my finger hovered just above the receiver. I stared at the phone for what felt like an eternity, until finally I reached out and clicked the button to answer. This time, I wasn't greeted with silence. Instead, I heard a sound, a soft scraping noise, like something dragging across the floor. The sound was faint at first, barely audible, but it seemed to get louder the longer I listened. I froze in my chair. It was hard to place what it was. It wasn't the static I was used to hearing on misdirected calls. It wasn't even the breath I had heard earlier. It was something else. Something that felt deliberate. My pulse quickened. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaking slightly, even though I was trying my best to keep calm. But the scraping continued, followed by the same heavy breathing, now almost rhythmic, like whoever was on the other end was pacing. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the weirdness of the calls anymore. It was the sensation that something was watching me. Or waiting. I glanced around the empty office, the shadows stretching in the corners where the dim lighting couldn't reach. The place felt huge and empty, now too empty. The sound continued. That scraping. It was closer this time. I felt my throat tighten. The last time the call had ended abruptly, but this time I couldn't bring myself to hang up. I couldn't move. I was trapped, just sitting there, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. The call ended without warning, but the office felt different. My skin was prickling. The hairs on my arms stood up. I quickly glanced at the phone display. The number was still there, blank, as if it was being erased right before my eyes. But it wasn't the call that sent a shock through me. It was the feeling that the office had shifted. It wasn't just the lights flickering more often, or the coldness in the air. The hum of the machinery had changed. It felt heavier. The click of my keyboard as I typed didn't seem as sharp. The low buzz of the computers had a distorted quality, as if the world around me had suddenly been filtered through a thick fog. I forced myself to get up, needing to move, needing to do something to shake off the feeling that was consuming me. I paced through the office, my footsteps echoing far too loudly in the empty space. The silence outside of my steps was deafening, and I felt as though I was being swallowed by it. The faint scrape of my shoes on the tile floor was drowned out by the oppressive weight of the air. I moved towards the back of the office, to the storage closet where the electrical panel was located. Maybe a breaker had tripped, maybe something was malfunctioning. But when I opened the door to the small, dimly lit room, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The lights flickered above, but that was nothing new. The panel was intact. No switches out of place. Just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard it again. A faint click, like someone had pressed a button. My head whipped around, but there was no one in the closet. The storage room was empty, just shelves of office supplies and equipment. I was alone. The click came again, but this time it was followed by a soft whistling sound. A draft? I glanced up at the vents overhead, but they weren't blowing any air. I quickly shut the door and walked back to my desk, every step feeling heavier than the last. I had to keep working. I had to keep moving, or I might lose it. I sat down in my chair, trying to focus on my screen, but the cursor on the computer kept jumping randomly. The text seemed to blur and shift every time I blinked. The office was no longer just cold. It was suffocating. That's when the phone rang again. The same number. The same disconnected display. I let out a shaky breath. I had to answer it. I had to know what was happening. I clicked the headset back on and pressed the button to accept the call, bracing myself for whatever strange noise would come this time. But this time, there was no noise at all. I stared at the phone in confusion, but there was nothing. The line was completely silent, yet the phone felt strangely warm against my ear. I could almost feel a presence on the other side of the call, like someone was waiting for me to speak. The silence stretched on, pressing in on me, becoming louder with each passing second. The longer I stayed on the line, the more I felt something in the room shift. The temperature dropped. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered and hummed. The shadows on the walls grew longer, moving with a strange, unnatural fluidity. I glanced at the clock on the wall, trying to distract myself, but the numbers seemed to blur together. The time wasn't passing normally. It was as if the seconds were stretching into minutes, each one slipping further out of my grasp. The sound of footsteps, soft, slow, and deliberate, echoed from somewhere far in the distance, but there was no one there. No one in the office, no one anywhere. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They seemed to be moving toward me, circling the desk. My breath caught in my throat. But when I looked up, I was alone. The footsteps stopped. The silence in the room grew unbearable. It felt like the entire office was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, the scraping noise returned, faint at first, but steadily growing louder. The same scraping from before. Only this time, I could swear it was coming from underneath the desk. My heart raced. I bent down, squinting into the darkness beneath my desk, but there was nothing there. Just the empty floor, covered in scattered papers and dust. The noise stopped. The air grew colder. I sat back up and looked around, my mind racing. The clock on the wall showed 3:02 a.m., but the office felt wrong. The shadows seemed to stretch out longer, and the light from the fluorescent bulbs flickered more erratically. I didn't want to stay in the office any longer, but I couldn't leave. I couldn't abandon my shift, but I didn't know what to do anymore. As the minutes ticked on, the calls kept coming, each one stranger than the last. The disconnected number, the eerie silence, the scraping noises, the breathing, the footsteps, and all the while, I felt that presence growing, something lurking just beyond my line of sight. The fear I had felt earlier was no longer a distant worry, it was real. It was here, in the room with me. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening. The office felt like it was closing in on me. Every time I blinked, the space around me seemed to get darker, more suffocating. The cold was now unbearable, seeping into my bones, and the silence hung thick in the air, pressing down on me. The flickering lights overhead had long since stopped offering any comfort. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs was louder now, almost like a low growl. Everything felt distorted, out of sync. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat echoing through the stillness of the room. The phone had stopped ringing for a while. I hadn't received a call in over an hour, and I was beginning to wonder if I had somehow imagined the strange events. I wasn't sure how long I had been sitting there, staring at the blank screen of my computer. Time seemed irrelevant now, the hours blending together in a haze of fear and confusion. I needed a break. I stood up abruptly, my legs weak from sitting still for so long, and walked to the small kitchen area. I poured myself a cup of lukewarm coffee, hoping the caffeine would give me some clarity. As I took the first sip, I heard it. A soft tap. I froze, the mug halfway to my mouth. It was faint at first, like a knock on a door. Then another tap, and another, growing louder and more insistent. I set the mug down on the counter with trembling hands and walked toward the source of the noise. It was coming from the back of the office, near the storage closet. I could feel my pulse quicken as I approached the hallway leading to the storage area. The lights flickered again, casting long shadows across the floor. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, but it was no use. The fear had already taken root. Another tap. This time, it was followed by a soft scratching sound like fingernails on wood. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was certain I wasn't imagining it. The sound was real. My feet were moving before I had even processed what I was doing. I turned the corner into the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The office felt even colder now, and the air seemed to shimmer, heavy with an unspoken tension. I reached the storage closet. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to see a sliver of darkness inside. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't see anything, but I felt the unmistakable presence of something or someone waiting. The tapping stopped, but the scratching continued, only now it seemed to be coming from inside the closet. The sound grew louder, as though whatever was making it was drawing closer, moving toward the door. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated, my mind racing, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I had to see what was inside. I threw the door open. Nothing. The closet was empty. The shelves were stacked with old supplies, dusty and unused. There was no one there. The room was exactly as it had been before, quiet, still, and dark. But as I stepped back, trying to process what had just happened, I saw it. A figure in the corner. It was a shadow at first, just a silhouette against the far wall. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it more clearly. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. The figure was tall, too tall, almost impossibly so. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and it stood completely still, its face obscured by the shadows. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen in place, my eyes locked on the figure that wasn't supposed to be there. The silence around me felt oppressive, crushing. Then it shifted. The figure didn't just step forward, it glided, floating across the room with an eerie grace, its movements unnatural, as though it wasn't bound by the laws of physics. My heart skipped a beat. The thing, it wasn't human. It couldn't be. I stumbled back, my legs giving out from under me. I hit the floor hard, the sound of my body hitting the tile echoing through the stillness. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to scramble away, but my limbs felt heavy, sluggish, like I was moving underwater. The figure moved closer, its form blurring in and out of focus. It seemed to be drawing near, its shape distorting with each step. I could hear something now, a faint whisper, but not words. It was like a low hum, a vibration that resonated deep within my chest. I could feel its presence. It was right in front of me. I could hear it breathing. I don't know how long I was on the floor, staring up at it. My mind was racing, my heart threatening to explode in my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. All I could do was watch as the figure loomed over me, its shape still shifting, its shadow stretching out like a darkened veil. And then it spoke. Not in a voice, but in a thought. A message. It wasn't audible. It was inside my mind, clear and cold and suffocating. You should never have answered the call. The words cut through me like a knife, sharp and cold. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world around me started to spin. I could feel my vision blur, the edges of the room slipping out of focus. My body was numb, completely paralyzed. The figure bent down, its face still hidden in the shadows. It was so close now that I could feel the air around it shift, heavy and oppressive. I could almost taste the cold that seemed to seep into my skin, into my bones. It's too late now. I gasped, a sharp intake of air that felt like it was ripping my chest open. The voice, or whatever it was getting louder, vibrating in my head like 1,000 voices all at once. I could feel it, feel the presence of the thing inside me, inside my mind. The scraping sound returned, louder now, like claws scratching at the inside of my skull. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight. But I couldn't. My vision faded. My last conscious thought was the feeling of the thing's presence, suffocating and cold, its form closing in on me, consuming everything around me. And then there was nothing. When I woke up, the office was quiet, eerily quiet. The kind of silence that makes the walls feel like they're closing in, pressing on you from all sides. My body was still heavy, my head pounding as if I had been struck by something. The cold air in the office felt different now. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something else. Something I couldn't quite place, but I felt it deep in my chest. I pulled myself up from the floor, my limbs stiff and weak. The tile beneath me was cold, but it was a strange kind of cold, not the refreshing chill of the air conditioning, but something much more sinister, something unnatural. My heart was still racing, the fear still gripping me, and I couldn't shake the sensation that something was terribly wrong. I glanced around the office. The storage closet door was wide open, the darkness inside somehow darker than it should have been. I couldn't help but feel that the shadows had deepened, as if the room itself had swallowed something. The figure, the presence that had loomed over me, was gone, but I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. The silence seemed almost mocking now, like a cruel reminder that whatever had happened wasn't over. It was just waiting for the right moment to return. I stumbled to my desk, my legs shaky beneath me. My hands hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to type anything. I didn't want to make a call. I didn't want to hear that phone ring again, didn't want to see that display flash with a disconnected number. I didn't want to know if the figure would return, or if the next call would be even worse than the last. I needed to leave. But the office wasn't mine to leave. I was just an employee. I had to stay. The fear inside me screamed against the reality of my situation. I had to stay. I had no choice. That's when the phone rang again. I froze. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness of the room. The shrill tone reverberated in my head, like nails scratching against the inside of my skull. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the phone, terrified to pick it up, terrified of what I would hear on the other end. I wanted to ignore it, to walk away, to leave this place behind, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop myself from reaching for it. My fingers shook as I picked up the receiver. I held it to my ear, but there was no sound at first. Just silence. The kind of silence that presses on you like a weight. My pulse was pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then the whisper. It was soft, barely a breath, but it was there. "You're still here." My skin crawled. The voice was familiar. It was the same voice I had heard in my head, the same thought that had echoed through my mind before. The thing was still out there, and it was speaking to me. It was here, in the room with me. I could feel it, just like before. I slammed the phone down, my hands trembling violently. My chest felt tight, as if the air itself had thickened, making it harder to breathe. My heart was a jackhammer in my chest, and my thoughts were scattered, disjointed. I could still hear the voice echoing in my mind, the words repeating over and over again. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. Without thinking, I grabbed my bag, shoved my phone into it, and bolted for the door. I didn't care if I had to break the lock to get out. I wasn't staying another second in that office. The hallways were dark, even darker than usual, and I could feel the shadows pressing in on me. The floor beneath my feet felt strange, slick as if something was moving beneath it. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to know what was following me, if anything was. I just needed to get out. The elevator was just a few steps away. I rushed toward it, praying it would come, praying it would take me somewhere far, far away from that place. I pressed the button over and over again, my hands slick with sweat. When the doors finally opened, I almost cried with relief. But the moment I stepped inside, the air grew heavy again. The same suffocating, unnatural cold. The same feeling of being watched, of being followed. I hit the ground floor button, but the elevator didn't move. It was stuck. The lights flickered. The hum of the elevator became louder, almost like a growl. And then I heard it. A soft tap, 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 echoing from the corner of the elevator. My heart stopped. I turned, but the corner was empty. Nothing was there. But the tapping continued, growing louder, closer. I pressed myself into the corner of the elevator, shaking uncontrollably. The tapping grew into a scratching sound, nails against metal, scraping, clawing at the walls. The elevator was moving now, but it wasn't going down. It was going up. I tried to press the emergency button, but nothing happened. The elevator moved faster now, jerking slightly as it ascended. The sound of the scratching was deafening. It was all I could hear. Don't look. I heard the voice again, this time in my ear. The voice I had heard before. The thing was here, in the elevator with me. It's too late for you. I wanted to scream, but the words were stuck in my throat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My hands were gripping the rail so tightly I thought my fingers would snap. When the doors finally opened, I stumbled out of the elevator, my body shaking, my legs weak. I didn't know where I was, didn't care. I just needed to get out of that building. But as I ran through the hallways, I realized something. The building was empty. There were no other workers, no other employees, no one. It was silent, but not the quiet kind of silence. This was the silence of something being erased, of something vanishing into thin air. I didn't know how, but I knew that no one else was here anymore. I burst through the front doors, into the cool night air. I breathed in deeply, but the air didn't feel like it should. It didn't smell fresh. It smelled like something was rotting, something dead. I ran into the street, not caring about the cars speeding past me, not caring about anything except getting away from that place. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that the presence was still with me. It was still out there, waiting, watching. I don't know how long I ran. I don't know how far I got. But eventually I stopped. My legs gave out from under me, and I collapsed in the middle of the street, gasping for air. And that's when I heard the tapping again. The tapping grew louder, more persistent, until it seemed to shake the ground beneath me. I couldn't pinpoint the source of the sound. Was it in my head? Was it the sound of footsteps approaching from behind? It didn't matter. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. No matter how far I ran, no matter how desperately I tried to escape, I couldn't outrun it. The presence, the thing that had followed me from the office, was always there, always close. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me as if they could give out at any moment. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The street was deserted, just the distant hum of traffic and the occasional echo of a car passing by. For all intents and purposes, I was alone. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling from the fear, the uncertainty. What had happened back there? What was that thing? Was it real? Or was it just my mind, pushed to the edge by too many sleepless nights, too many hours spent alone in a cold, sterile office? I wanted to believe it was the latter, that it was just some horrible hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but a small part of me knew better. The tapping sound was growing more pronounced, and as I turned around, my breath caught in my throat. It was standing there. The figure, draped in shadows, as if the night itself had shaped it into a form. I couldn't make out any details, its face, its body, only the vague impression of a figure too tall, too unnaturally still. It was just there, standing in the middle of the street, watching me. Fear gripped me like nothing I'd ever felt before. My body refused to move, paralyzed by the sheer presence of it. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I opened my mouth, but the sound that escaped was strangled, like it had been stolen from me before it could ever leave my throat. For a moment, the figure didn't move. Then, slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. The tapping sound followed its movements, each footfall like a hammer on the pavement. I should have run. I should have done something, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't cooperate. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes wide, locked onto the shape that was now impossibly close. I could almost feel it breathing, a cold, unnatural presence hovering in the air around me. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere, from inside my head and the very ground beneath me, I heard it speak. "You can't leave." The words echoed through me, reverberating in every bone, every fiber of my being. I was frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening, unable to process the reality of the situation. It was as if I had crossed some unseen threshold, stepped into a world where the rules of reality didn't apply. The thing wasn't just following me, it was connected to me, and somehow it was in control. I wanted to fight, to scream, to do anything to break free from its grip, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, a prisoner to the presence that loomed over me. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back, its presence receding like a tide pulling away from the shore. The tapping stopped. The air grew still again. The oppressive weight that had pressed against my chest seemed to lift, but only slightly. I dared to breathe. The figure was gone. The street was empty again. The night was silent. I was left standing there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. Had it been real? Had it been a hallucination, a trick of the mind? Or had I crossed some line, some boundary that I couldn't return from? I didn't know. I couldn't know. The questions would linger forever, unanswered. And the fear would never leave me. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring into the empty street, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. Was I free now? Was I safe? Or had it only been a brief reprieve before the next encounter, the next moment of terror? I couldn't stay there. I couldn't keep thinking about it, but I couldn't walk away either. Every part of me screamed to go back to the office, to confront whatever was waiting for me there, but my body refused to cooperate. I stumbled back, unable to make sense of the night. The streets felt foreign now, even though they were the same streets I'd walked down 1,000 times before. Nothing felt the same. The world had shifted, tilted ever so slightly, and I couldn't tell which way was up anymore. Was this over? Was I truly free? The haunting thought stayed with me as I turned and walked away, my mind consumed with the realization that I would never know. The thing was still out there, somewhere. It might not have followed me tonight, but I knew it was never truly gone. It was just another evening for me at the hotel where I worked. I'd been there for a few years, so I knew the routine well. The hotel itself was old, well over a century old, in fact. It had been renovated a few times, but it still carried that antique charm, the kind of place with creaky floors, faded carpet, and chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a different era. The sort of hotel you would walk into and feel like you were stepping back in time, though not in a bad way. It was quiet and peaceful, the kind of place where you didn't expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. I worked the evening shift, and on this particular night, I was assigned to cover the front desk and handle any requests or complaints that might come up. The hotel had a ballroom on the second floor, a large, expansive room where events like weddings, conferences, and parties took place. It was the kind of space that made you feel small when you stepped inside, with its high ceilings and long, elegant windows. The floor was made of polished wood, and even when no one was around, It looked like it could host some grand affair. I had always liked the ballroom, even though I didn't venture in there much. Most of the time, it was empty except for those special events. On this particular evening, things felt different. I couldn't quite explain why, but there was a strange energy in the air. Maybe it was just the tiredness settling in, or perhaps the rain that started to pour outside, tapping on the windows with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. It was one of those nights when you couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but you couldn't put your finger on it. I wasn't alone in the hotel that night. There was another staff member, Tom, who was in charge of maintenance. He usually handled any repairs or adjustments that came up, especially during the quieter hours when the hotel wasn't as busy. He was a nice guy, but we didn't talk much. He preferred to keep to himself, and honestly, I didn't mind. It was easier to focus on my work that way. As I sat behind the desk, sorting through a few invoices and checking in guests, I glanced up at the clock. It was just past midnight. I wasn't expecting anyone else to come in, but you never knew with this hotel. It had a way of surprising you. The lobby was quiet, with only the faint sound of the rain and the occasional rustle of papers breaking the silence. But despite the quiet, something felt a little off. Maybe it was the dim lighting or the way the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch just a little further than usual. The thought barely crossed my mind before I brushed it aside. I went back to my work, but my eyes kept drifting toward the ballroom's closed door. It was directly across from the lobby, a large, imposing set of wooden double doors. Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought, but tonight, there was something about it. It felt as though there was something waiting behind those doors, something that wasn't supposed to be there. But I shook it off, trying to refocus on my tasks. It wasn't like me to be so jumpy, and I wasn't about to let my imagination get the better of me. I had worked in this hotel for a while now, and I'd heard the stories about strange noises and odd occurrences everyone had. But those were just stories, nothing more, and I was determined to keep it that way. Still, as the minutes ticked by, my gaze kept returning to the ballroom. Something was different. I could feel it, but I didn't know what it was. The hotel had been a peaceful place for me. It was where I had made good memories and even found a sense of security. But tonight, that peace felt fragile, almost as though something were waiting to shatter it. And as I sat there in the dim glow of the front desk light, I had no idea that tonight the silence would break in a way I would never forget. It wasn't long after I'd shaken off the feeling of unease that things started to get a little odd. At first, it was subtle, so subtle, in fact, that I almost convinced myself it was nothing at all. But as the minutes turned to hours, it became clearer that something wasn't right. It started with a faint sound. I had been typing away on the computer at the front desk, working through the last few check-ins of the night, when I heard it. The softest of giggles, almost like a child's laugh, distant and muffled. I paused, my fingers frozen over the keyboard. The sound was faint, but distinct. It didn't come from the lobby, where guests would be, and it didn't seem to come from outside either. No, the laugh was coming from somewhere closer and somewhere inside the hotel. For a moment, I sat there, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind tapping against the building, or the sound of old pipes settling. But deep down, I knew that wasn't what I had heard. I glanced around the lobby. The lights flickered slightly, nothing out of the ordinary, just the occasional quirk of old wiring. But it was the silence that struck me. The hotel, for the most part, was empty. Guests had checked out earlier in the evening, and there were only a handful of staff members left working their shifts. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was here. I took a deep breath and stood up from the desk, stretching out my arms. Maybe it was just fatigue setting in. I hadn't slept much the night before, and I'd been working long hours. Perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I walked toward the back office to check on the logbook, I couldn't help but notice the door to the ballroom once again. It stood there, slightly ajar, just a crack, enough for me to see the faint glow of light from within. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the door. The ballroom had been completely empty when I last checked. There hadn't been an event for days, and the staff had long gone home. So why was there light spilling out from under the door? Curiosity got the better of me. I made my way toward the ballroom, my footsteps soft on the carpet. As I neared the door, the sound of muffled voices reached my ears. It wasn't clear what they were saying, but it was a group of voices talking over one another. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear. "Hello," I called out, but my voice felt small in the vast silence of the hotel. The voices stopped. Complete silence. I waited, but nothing happened. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart began to race. Slowly, I reached for the door handle. It was cold to the touch, more so than it should have been for the temperature in the lobby. I pulled the door open, the heavy wood creaking with the motion. As the door swung inward, I fully expected to see the ballroom just as I'd left it empty, dark and still. But instead, there was a faint glow coming from the far corner of the room, where the grand chandelier hung from the ceiling. The light wasn't bright, more like the flickering of candlelight, casting strange shadows on the polished wood floor. The ballroom looked different. It wasn't the grand, empty space I was familiar with. It felt alive, but no one was in sight. I stepped inside, my breath shallow as I scanned the room. The voices I had heard earlier, muffled and indistinct, were gone. All that was left was the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the emptiness. There, in the corner near the grand piano, I noticed something unusual. A table, previously out of place, was now sitting neatly under the chandelier. I was sure it hadn't been there before. The table was small, simple, with an empty chair pulled out beside it. But it wasn't the table that caught my attention. It was the faint scent of perfume that lingered in the air, clinging to the space as if someone had just walked by. My breath caught in my throat. No one had been in the ballroom for hours. There was no reason for anyone to be here now, and yet it felt as though someone had just left. The air felt thick, heavy with something unexplainable. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I could feel a chill creeping over me. I backed away slowly, unsure whether to stay or leave. As I turned to go, I heard it again, the faintest sound, a soft, playful giggle, this time much closer. I spun around, my eyes searching the room in panic, but there was no one there. The laughter seemed to linger in the air, bouncing off the walls, and for the briefest moment, it felt as though the room was closing in on me. I could feel my heartbeat quicken, the pulse in my ears ringing louder than the laughter itself. I bolted from the ballroom, the door slamming shut behind me. I didn't look back. When I returned to the front desk, I found Tom standing there, his hands resting on the counter. He looked at me with a raised eyebrow. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but curious. I didn't answer at first. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. The ballroom, the voices, the perfume, it was all so wrong. I had worked here for years and had never felt anything like this before. Was it just my imagination? Had I been hearing things? Or was there something more to this hotel than I had ever realized? I think I heard something, I finally managed to say, my voice shaky. In the ballroom, it was empty, but it didn't feel empty. There was light and voices. It was like someone was there, even though no one was. Tom looked at me with mild interest. "You sure you're not just tired?" he asked. "I've heard things here before too, but it's just the old building settling. You get used to it." I nodded, not fully convinced. Maybe it was the building. Maybe it was just me being overworked. But deep down, something told me that what I had experienced wasn't something I could easily explain away. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. I couldn't stop thinking about the ballroom and what I had heard. The giggles, the voices, the coldness in the air, it all stayed with me long after I had returned to the front desk. But nothing else happened that night. The rest of my shift went by uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was as though the hotel itself was aware of my fear, playing tricks on me, testing how far it could push before I broke. I didn't tell Tom about the giggles or the voices again. I didn't know what I would have said, or if he would have believed me. The days that followed that first unsettling night seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one heavier than the last. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe I had worked too many late shifts, and the fatigue was finally catching up to me. Maybe the hotel was just old, no, not old, ancient, its walls creaking and groaning under the weight of years, its pipes and wires making strange noises in the night. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more impossible it became to ignore. It started small. The flickering of lights, soft whispers that I couldn't quite make out, objects slightly out of place. One night, I noticed the chandelier in the lobby swaying ever so slightly. No one had been near it. It wasn't windy, and yet it moved as though it had been brushed by an unseen hand. I had been standing by the desk, going through paperwork, when I glanced up at it. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the chandelier gently rocking back and forth. The movement was so subtle that I thought I was seeing things at first, but then it moved again. I stepped closer, hesitating, my hand hovering over the desk. What was causing it? The windows were shut, and the air conditioning wasn't on. It was dead still in the room, except for the chandelier's eerie motion. I stood there for a moment, waiting for the movement to stop, but it didn't. In fact, the longer I watched, the more it seemed to sway, picking up speed just slightly. My eyes darted around the lobby, half expecting to see someone else standing there, but no one was around. I quickly stepped back, not sure if I should investigate or run out of the building. I'd already convinced myself it was just another quirk of the old place, but the feeling of unease crept into my chest like a cold, tight knot. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing little noises, scraping, dragging, faint laughter, like someone was pacing the hallways just outside my door. But that night was only the beginning. The next evening, things started to escalate. I had been working alone again, like usual, with the front desk all to myself. It was late around 2 in the morning, and I had just checked out the last of the night guests. The hotel was nearly empty, and the sound of my own breathing filled the room. That's when I heard it again, the laughter. This time, it was much louder and clearer. It came from the ballroom. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It sounded like a group of people laughing, almost like they were having a party. It was impossible. No one was scheduled to use the ballroom. We hadn't hosted any events for a week, and the doors to the ballroom were locked. There was no reason anyone should be in there. I stood up from the desk slowly, my feet feeling heavy as I walked toward the ballroom. The sound of the laughter grew louder as I neared the door, and I felt my skin crawl. It was the same giggling I had heard before, but now there was something more to it, something almost sinister. The sound felt wrong, like it was echoing from deep within the walls, making my ears ring. I reached for the handle, but as soon as my fingers touched it, the laughter stopped. Dead silence. For a moment, I stood there, frozen. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, my breath shallow. The door felt unusually cold beneath my fingertips. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open, half expecting something to jump out at me. But when it swung wide, the ballroom was empty. Just like before. I stepped inside cautiously, my shoes clicking against the hardwood floor as I scanned the room. The chandelier was still, hanging high above me, and the soft glow of the distant lights illuminated the vast, empty space. But it felt different. It wasn't the same empty room I'd walked through the night before. There was a heavy presence in the air, something unseen, but very much there. as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I walked deeper into the room, my every step echoing in the emptiness. The faint smell of perfume lingered in the air, the same scent I'd noticed before. It was stronger now, almost cloying, like it was settling into the very fabric of the room. The air was thick with it, as though the scent had been absorbed into the walls, the floor, the furniture. I could feel my hands trembling as I moved further in, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe someone had been in here earlier. Maybe it was a guest who had somehow snuck in. But that didn't explain the laughter. That didn't explain the coldness that seemed to seep into my bones, or the way the air felt charged with something I couldn't identify. As I turned to leave, the door to the ballroom slammed shut behind me. The sound was deafening. I whipped around, panic rising in my chest, but when I tried to open the door again, it wouldn't budge. My hands were shaking as I gripped the handle, pulling with all my strength. It was like the door had locked itself. I stepped back, my heart racing as I glanced around the empty lobby. The hotel felt even quieter now, if that was possible. Every tiny sound, every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified in the silence. The walls felt too close, as though the hotel was shrinking around me. I stood there for a moment, my chest tightening, unsure of what to do next. Then I heard something. Footsteps. But there was no one else in the lobby. I spun around, my heart thumping in my chest. The sound was unmistakable footsteps moving across the floor, soft but deliberate. They weren't coming from the direction of the front door. No, they were coming from the far end of the hall, near the staff offices. I froze, straining my ears, trying to place the sound. It grew louder, closer, and just as it seemed like someone was about to appear from around the corner, the footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. The silence stretched on, thick and unnerving. I wasn't sure what to do. My mind raced as I considered my options. Should I go check the staff offices? Should I call for help? But what if I was just imagining everything? What if there was no one there? My thoughts churned, each one more unsettling than the last. But the unease I felt, those footsteps, that laughter was real. It wasn't something I could easily dismiss. I slowly walked back toward the staff offices, my every step tentative. As I passed by the hallway leading to the ballroom, I glanced up at the door. It was still shut, but I could swear I saw a shadow shift just behind the crack. My blood ran cold. Without thinking, I rushed to the office, grabbing the phone. My fingers shook as I dialed the manager's number, praying for some sort of reassurance. But when I heard the phone on the other end pick up, it wasn't the manager's voice I heard. It was laughter. The same haunting, childlike laughter. I dropped the phone, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and I needed to get out of the hotel, out of that building, before whatever was inside it found me. But even as I turned to leave, I felt the unmistakable sensation that I was no longer alone. The night air outside was heavy with a quiet unease, and as I stepped into the darkness of the hotel's front entrance, I could feel it, something I couldn't put into words, but it clung to me like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. It had been a long, agonizing few hours since that unsettling phone call. I had tried to call again and again, but the phone line was dead. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. It had been chasing me all night, its presence lingering in the corners of my mind, seeping into my every thought. I was ready to leave. I had had enough. My mind was made up. But just as I reached for the hotel's front door, the laughter came again. It echoed down the empty hallway, and this time it was unmistakable. There was no mistaking the malicious, mocking tone that twisted the sound. It wasn't just a laugh anymore. It was a shriek of glee, as if whatever was in the hotel was reveling in my fear. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. I should have run. I should have ignored everything I'd heard, every warning sign. But something inside me, something deep and primal, pulled me forward. With shaky hands, I turned away from the door and walked back down the hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. I didn't know where I was going anymore. All I knew was that I had to find the source of the laughter. I had to know what was behind all of this. But the closer I got to the ballroom, the more I felt the presence close in around me. It wasn't just the laughter now, it was everything. The air had grown thick, heavy, as if the hotel itself was alive, breathing, watching. I reached the ballroom doors, my pulse quickening. There was no sound now, no footsteps or whispers, just a thick silence that pressed down on me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I took a deep breath, my hand reaching for the door. It was cold to the touch, and my fingers seemed to numb against the handle. Something was waiting inside. I knew it. As the door swung open, the room felt different. The air was frigid, like stepping into a tomb. I stepped inside, my shoes scraping against the floor, the sound sharp in the stillness. It was darker than usual. There were no lights, no glowing bulbs above, just shadows stretching across the vast space, as if the room itself had taken on a life of its own. The chandelier above me was still, its intricate crystal design barely visible in the dim light. I glanced around, feeling a creeping unease wrap around me like a suffocating blanket. The laughter was gone now, but the silence was worse, absolute silence, as if the entire room was holding its breath. The sense of wrongness hung thick in the air, and my heartbeat pounded in my chest, each thud reverberating in the empty space. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the ballroom, in the deepest shadow, something moved. It was a figure tall, dark, and silent. It stood there, just outside the edge of the dim light, as though it had been waiting for me. I could barely make it out, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't just a person standing there. It was something else, something wrong. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I stood frozen, my body refusing to move. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want to believe it, but the longer I stood there, the more it seemed to draw me in. Slowly, almost as if in a trance, my feet carried me forward, my legs trembling beneath me. I wanted to run, but something held me there. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It wasn't human. It was something more, a shadow, a distortion in the space around it, as though it didn't belong. I could feel the cold radiating from it, icy and unnatural, and every step I took toward it felt like I was walking into the grip of death itself. Then it moved. It was slow at first, just a shift of the figure, a slight change in its position. But then it took a step forward, and that's when I saw its face. Or rather, what was supposed to be its face. It wasn't a face at all, just an empty, hollow void. A black, gaping hole where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. I couldn't look away, couldn't tear my eyes from that inhuman, empty space. The hole seemed to suck in the surrounding darkness, growing larger with every second. It felt as if the figure was consuming everything around it, swallowing the room whole. A sudden, sharp pain shot through my head, and I stumbled back, clutching my skull as if something was trying to force its way inside. I could hear my own heartbeat, faster and faster, pounding in my ears. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I fought to stay upright as the figure continued to advance. It didn't move like a person. It glided, its feet barely touching the ground as it floated closer, its presence growing more suffocating with each passing second. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The air was thick, as if my words were being swallowed before they could even reach my lips. I could feel the temperature in the room dropping rapidly, my body trembling as the figure's coldness reached me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs were locked in place. I couldn't move. It was too close now. I could see the outline of its arms, thin, bony, like the limbs of a skeleton wrapped in shadow. It raised one hand, the fingers long and spindly, reaching toward me, and that's when the voice came. It was a whisper, low, guttural, and filled with malice. It echoed around me, reverberating through my mind, as if it were coming from inside my own head. "You shouldn't have come back." The words were slow, deliberate, as if savoring my fear. I could feel my legs shaking, my body freezing in place as the figure's hand hovered just inches from my face. The cold from its touch seeped into my skin, burning with a pain I couldn't describe, like the sensation of frostbite creeping beneath my skin. My pulse raced as I finally managed to tear my gaze away from the figure and look around the room. The ballroom had changed. The walls were no longer just cracked, aged plaster. They had begun to warp and distort, as though they were alive, breathing, bending around me. The once distant chandelier above had grown dim and flickering, casting shadows that seemed to move and writhe on their own. Suddenly, I heard footsteps again. They weren't coming from outside the room. They were coming from within. The laughter returned, louder this time, almost deafening, echoing in the walls, bouncing off the high ceiling and filling every corner of the room. But it wasn't just one voice. No, there were many voices, hundreds of them, all laughing in unison. High-pitched giggles mixed with low, guttural chuckles, creating a dissonant chorus that felt like it was breaking my mind. The figure, still hovering just a few feet away, grinned, or at least I think it did. Its mouth was nothing but a hollow void, but I could feel its presence smiling at me, mocking me. "You belong here now," it whispered again. "You're one of us." With a final scream of terror, I stumbled back, my legs finally giving way beneath me. My head was spinning, my vision blurring as I hit the ground. The laughter was so loud now that it felt like my skull would crack under the pressure. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the room went silent. The figure was gone. The chandelier stopped swaying, the shadows settled, and the temperature in the room returned to normal. I lay on the cold floor, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. The fear, no. The terror was still coursing through my veins, but everything else was still, too still. The room around me seemed to pulse with the echo of the laughter still lingering in my ears, even though it had vanished in an instant. I lay there on the floor, barely able to move, every muscle in my body screaming at me to get up, to run, to escape the suffocating weight of the hotel that seemed to press down on me from every direction. For a moment, all I could do was breathe. Shallow, quick gasps that burned my lungs, my throat tight from the terror that still gripped me. I tried to make sense of everything, to piece together what had just happened. But the more I tried, the more my mind rebelled. The hotel, the figure, the laughter, the cold. It was all too much, too impossible to understand. It was as if reality itself had bent in on itself, leaving me lost in some nightmarish dreamscape from which there was no escape. I didn't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear and confusion. All I knew was that the longer I stayed, the closer I felt that cold presence creeping back, watching me, waiting for me to stand and face it again. And I wouldn't. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to my feet. My legs wobbled beneath me, threatening to buckle under the weight of everything that had happened. I had to get out. I didn't care what it took. I wasn't going to stay another second in that place. But just as I stood, something caught my eye. The ballroom doors, which I had entered just moments before, were now wide open, and in the doorway stood a figure. It was just a silhouette, barely visible in the dim light, but I knew without a doubt that it wasn't a person. It couldn't be. There was something wrong with it, just as there had been something wrong with the figure I had seen moments ago. This new one was different, but just as chilling. I felt the fear wash over me again, but it was mixed with something else now, anger. This wasn't just some twisted joke, some illusion. This was real. Whatever was in this hotel had a hold on me, and I was done playing by its rules. I turned and ran. My feet carried me out of the ballroom as fast as I could manage, my heart pounding in my chest as I darted through the hallways. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. If I did, I knew I'd see it. The figure. The shadows. The cold. I had to leave, and I had to do it now. As I ran, I could hear the sounds of footsteps behind me, the unmistakable rhythm of something or someone following me. I didn't know if it was the figure or something else, but I didn't care. I just had to make it to the front door. When I reached the lobby, I barely slowed down. I didn't stop to look around, didn't stop to think about what might be waiting for me in the shadows. I just kept moving, pushing through the lobby's grand doors, out into the night air. It was cool outside, a welcome contrast to the suffocating heat inside the hotel. But even the fresh air didn't seem to chase away the panic clawing at my chest. I was free, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. That whatever had been in that ballroom was still out there, waiting. I didn't look back. I didn't look back as I ran down the steps, across the parking lot, and into my car. The engine roared to life the moment I turned the key, and I didn't waste a second. I slammed the car into drive, tires screeching as I sped away from the hotel, not daring to slow down until I was miles away. The hotel faded into the rearview mirror, the looming silhouette of the building growing smaller with every passing second. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure. That hollow, empty face. The cold, dark presence. The laughter that seemed to chase me no matter how far I ran. I kept the lights on in my room, the television blaring in an attempt to drown out the memories. But nothing worked. The images stayed with me, burned into my mind, no matter how much I tried to push them away. The next day, I went back to the hotel. I had to. I needed answers. What had happened? What was that thing I had seen? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there something more to it? I couldn't let it go. I had to know what I had experienced. But when I arrived, the hotel was different. It didn't look the same. The once grand entrance was now boarded up, the windows blacked out as if the hotel had been abandoned for years. It was as if it had never been there at all. I walked around the building, desperate to find something, anything that would explain what had happened. But there was nothing. No sign of the hotel's staff, no sign of the ballroom, no trace of the room I had stayed in. It was as if the hotel had vanished, like a dream slipping through my fingers the moment I tried to hold on to it. I called the local authorities, thinking maybe they would have answers. But when they arrived, they were just as confused as I was. No one had ever heard of the hotel. There were no records of it existing. The address I had stayed at led to an empty plot of land, nothing but overgrown weeds and a vacant lot. The officers chalked it up to a strange incident, maybe even a case of sleep deprivation or a vivid hallucination. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had experienced. The hotel wasn't just some figment of my imagination. It was real. I left the town that day, and I never went back. But the memories never left me. They're still with me, haunting me. Every shadow I pass, every old building I see, I wonder if it's there, lurking, waiting for me to return. I can't explain it. Maybe it was a ghost. Maybe it was something else. But I can't shake the feeling that the hotel is still out there, still calling to me in the dark, still waiting for my return. And I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't run? What would have happened if I had stayed to face whatever it was that haunted that ballroom? Would I have been able to resolve it? Or would I have been trapped forever, a part of the hotel's twisted past. The answers, it seems, will never come, and perhaps that's the most terrifying part of all. It was the kind of day where everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The sky was clear, and the air was cool with the kind of crispness that only early fall can offer. The forest trail was familiar, a place I had hiked through dozens of times before. It's the kind of place where you don't think twice about venturing off the beaten path, where the crunch of leaves underfoot and the smell of pine needles feel like home. I had set out alone, just wanting to escape the noise of daily life for a while and enjoy a peaceful walk in the woods. I had been hiking for nearly an hour, making my way through a dense forest with towering oak trees lining the path. The kind of trees that seem to stand for centuries, their bark weathered and worn. There's something comforting about the stillness of nature, and I found myself lost in the rhythm of my own footsteps, the only sound breaking the silence being the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There's always something about being alone in the woods that makes you more aware of your surroundings. But that day, I didn't feel any sense of danger or unease. I wasn't on high alert. It felt like just another hike. After all, I had walked these paths countless times before, so nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then I saw him. At first, I thought he was just another hiker, perhaps someone like me who had wandered off the main trail for a bit of solitude. He was an older man, his back hunched slightly as he walked with a slow, deliberate pace. He wore a faded jacket and sturdy boots, the kind that looked like they had been through a lot. The sort of boots that tell a story. His face was weathered, with deep lines etched into his skin, and his gray hair was messy, sticking out in all directions like he hadn't bothered to comb it in days. I could feel my gaze lingering on him for a second longer than it should have, but I quickly looked away, not wanting to stare. I had seen enough of people on this trail to know that most of them were just passing through, each on their own journey. So I didn't think much of it when he turned towards me. He didn't greet me with a smile or even a nod of acknowledgement. Instead, he just stared for a moment, almost like he was assessing me. I could feel my heart skip a beat, but I told myself it was just a fluke, an odd moment, nothing more. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, raspy, like someone who hadn't used it in a while. "Do you know what time it is?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly as if the question was of great importance. I glanced at my watch. "It's just afternoon," I replied, surprised by the suddenness of the question. The man nodded, but he didn't move away. Instead, he stood there, staring at me for a long while. His gaze wasn't threatening, but it was intense, as if he were trying to see straight through me. I shifted uncomfortably under his stare, but I didn't say anything. He spoke again, this time a bit more softly. "Do you know where you're going?" The question struck me as odd. I was on a trail I knew well, of course. I knew where I was going. But something about the way he asked it made me pause. I wanted to brush it off as just a weird interaction, but something in his eyes made me hesitate. "Yeah," I replied, offering a small smile to ease the weirdness of the moment. "Just heading up the trail a bit. Shouldn't be too much longer before I turn around and head back." The man didn't respond. Instead, he simply nodded again, but this time there was something unsettling about it. It wasn't a reassuring gesture. It felt more like he was considering my answer, weighing it, or perhaps even doubting it. "You'll need to be careful," he said, his tone low and serious. "The forest can be tricky, you know. Paths change. Things aren't always what they seem." His words left me with a strange feeling in my stomach, but I brushed it off. People say odd things all the time, especially older folks who have spent too much time on their own. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, offering another awkward smile as I began to step around him. But as I walked away, something felt off. I couldn't quite place it, but the way he spoke, the way he seemed to look right through me, it stuck with me. It wasn't a malicious encounter. Just one of those strange, almost surreal moments you sometimes have when you're alone. And yet, the further I walked, the more the words of that man replayed in my mind. The paths change. That's when I started to feel like maybe I wasn't alone in the woods anymore. There was no real reason for it, but the air felt denser, heavier, as if the forest had grown quieter since our brief encounter. I tried to shake it off. It wasn't the first time I'd come across a strange person in the woods, after all. People wander off the main trail all the time. But something in the back of my mind nagged at me, as if the moment wasn't finished. And then, something happened. I looked around, my eyes scanning the trees, the familiar trail ahead of me. That's when I noticed a small path off to the side, one I hadn't seen before. It was narrow, barely visible under the overgrowth, but it was there. For a brief second, I considered turning back. I had never seen this path on any of my previous hikes, but curiosity pushed me forward. After all, I'd come this far, and the trail was hardly dangerous, right? It was just another path. Or so I thought. As I took a step towards the new trail, I felt a sudden chill. The temperature dropped noticeably, the warmth of the sun fading into a sharp, unnatural cold. I froze, suddenly aware that the woods had grown silent, too silent. Even the rustling of the trees seemed to have stopped. That's when I heard a faint sound behind me, like someone's footsteps, soft but unmistakable. The moment I heard those footsteps behind me, I froze. It wasn't the usual noise you'd expect from someone walking through a forest. No crunch of twigs underfoot, no rustling of leaves. It was more like the faintest brush of footsteps, too deliberate to be a trick of the wind. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I slowly turned around, expecting to see someone, anyone, behind me. But there was no one there. The path I had just left was empty. The trees were still and silent, with only the distant rustling of leaves far off in the distance. It was almost as if the world around me had come to a halt. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the unease creeping into my chest. It had to have been a bird, or maybe an animal, some creature I hadn't noticed. The forest was full of life, after all. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the quiet, which had become unnervingly intense. It was the weight of it, all the sense that I was being watched. I glanced around, scanning the trees once again. Nothing. The familiar sights of the forest trail did little to ease my discomfort. It felt as though the woods had grown unnaturally still, like they were holding their breath, waiting for something. I tried to push the feeling aside, chalking it up to nerves. After all, I was alone in the woods, and it wasn't unusual to feel a little jumpy from time to time. But as I resumed my walk, that nagging feeling remained, like a constant presence just out of reach. Then I heard it again. This time, the footsteps were closer. I could hear them more clearly, just behind me. Soft, steady, like someone walking in my exact footsteps, mimicking my pace. I stopped once again, but when I looked behind me, the path was as empty as before. Okay, this is getting ridiculous, I muttered to myself. I shook my head and took another step, trying to convince myself it was all in my mind. But with each passing second, the strange sensation grew stronger. The air felt colder now, sharper, and the world around me seemed to press in tighter. I glanced over my shoulder again, just to reassure myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Nothing. But I was no longer alone, at least not in the way I'd been moments ago. A rustling sound from the bushes caught my attention. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, as if something or someone was moving through the underbrush. I turned my head toward the sound, my heart racing in my chest. There, just beyond the edge of the path, something shifted in the shadows. It was too far for me to make out any details, but there was a shape, a presence that didn't belong. I stepped back, my body tensing instinctively. My mind told me it was probably just an animal, a deer, or maybe a fox. But the rational part of me struggled to believe that explanation. The feeling was wrong. There was an intent behind it, a purpose to the way the presence seemed to follow me. I tried to call out, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't explain why, but a deep unease settled in my gut. It was as though I knew if I spoke, if I acknowledged whatever was out there, it would hear me, and that was the last thing I wanted. The fear that had been slowly creeping up on me now surged, overwhelming my every sense. The moment stretched out, heavy and silent, until the rustling ceased. Whatever had been hiding in the underbrush was gone. I blinked, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. But the sensation remained, a chilling presence that refused to let go. I took a deep breath, then another, forcing myself to move forward. There was no reason to panic, I told myself. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear. But as I pushed onward, my mind kept drifting back to the man I had met earlier, the strange way he had spoken about the forest. The paths change. Things aren't always what they seem. His words echoed in my head, twisting and turning as I continued my hike. It felt like a warning, a premonition that I hadn't fully understood at the time. And now, walking deeper into the woods, I was beginning to feel like I was trapped in whatever strange force he had hinted at. I stopped once again, this time looking around with a sharper eye. The trees seemed different, almost foreign now. The sunlight, which had once filtered through the canopy in beautiful, dappled patterns, now cast strange, elongated shadows across the path. The breeze that had been so gentle earlier now felt sharp, carrying with it the faintest whisper of something I couldn't quite identify. It was then that I noticed something that hadn't been there before, a small, twisted shape nestled in the underbrush, just off the trail. At first, I thought it was just a fallen branch or a tangle of roots. But as I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. It was a doll. It was a small, weathered thing with a cracked porcelain face and faded clothing. It looked old, like it had been lying there for years. I reached out, my fingers hovering above it. There was something about it that didn't sit right with me, something off, like it didn't belong in the forest. The doll's empty eyes seemed to stare up at me, unblinking, as though it were waiting for something. I quickly pulled my hand back, my pulse quickening. I couldn't explain why, but that doll felt like an omen, like it had been placed there for a reason. I tried to dismiss the thought, but the unease only deepened. I turned away and continued walking, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just the vague, uncomfortable sensation I had felt before, it was more intense now, more insistent. The silence of the forest was stifling, and the longer I walked, the more I felt like something was just behind me, following me every step of the way. My mind raced. Was it the doll that had triggered this? Was I just overreacting to an odd encounter in the woods? Or was something else happening, something I couldn't quite explain? The path seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me, the trees closing in, the air growing thicker with each passing moment. I tried to steady my breathing, to convince myself that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And the worst part? I didn't know how to stop it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer in control. The woods, once familiar, now felt like a labyrinth. The more I tried to push forward, the more the sense of something lurking in the shadows gripped me. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground beneath me was reluctant to let me pass. And with each passing minute, it was becoming clear. The forest was changing, and I was caught in its grasp. The unease I had felt earlier had evolved into a palpable tension, a tightening in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it, that I was just a hiker in the woods, nothing more. But the whisper of leaves in the distance, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, felt too deliberate, too controlled, like it was meant to unsettle me. I tried to focus on my surroundings, thinking that if I could stay grounded in the present, I could push past the fear. The path ahead was winding, a series of turns that seemed to stretch longer than they should. The trees loomed tall and thick, their gnarled branches creating a canopy so dense that little sunlight could penetrate. It was colder now, too, and the air had a biting chill that made my breath visible in the dim light. The deeper I walked, the more the forest seemed to close in on me. But it wasn't just the physical surroundings that felt different, it was the silence. The usual sounds of wildlife, the rustling of small animals in the brush, the chirping of birds had all disappeared. There was no wind, no bird song, not even the distant hum of insects. The only sounds that filled the air were the soft crunch of my boots against the earth and the faintest of movements from behind me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The footsteps. It was subtle at first, like the faintest echo of my own steps, but the pattern was unmistakable now. Someone or something was following me. The sound was always a beat or two behind mine, keeping pace with me, never getting too close, but never falling too far behind. I had tried to look back earlier, but there was never anyone there. And yet, I could still feel its presence, as if the very air around me was watching and waiting. My heart began to race again, but I refused to stop. I couldn't, there was no time to turn back now. So I kept walking, my steps quickening, but every time I thought I had outpaced whatever was trailing me, the sound of footsteps would creep in once more. As I pressed on, the path grew even more twisted, the trees more oppressive. The air seemed to thicken, and I began to notice how the ground itself had changed. What had once been a well-trodden trail was now uneven, covered with patches of thick undergrowth that slowed my progress. I had to force my way through, pushing aside branches and stepping carefully around rocks and roots. But it wasn't the forest that had changed, it was me. The further I walked, the more I became aware of the subtle shift in my surroundings. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. There were other signs, too. Small things, easily dismissed at first. A shadow darting across the corner of my eye. The sound of something or someone breathing just beyond the edge of hearing. The sensation of being touched, not physically, but as though something unseen was brushing against my skin. And then there was the cold. It had grown colder with each passing hour, colder than it should have been for this time of year. The chills seeped into my bones, leaving me shivering despite the layers of clothing I had on. The air tasted metallic, sharp, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had wandered too far into the forest. Too deep into whatever strange world lay hidden just beneath the surface of the one I thought I knew. I had to know. I had to figure out what was going on. My curiosity, fueled by fear and the desperate need for answers, led me to stop at a clearing. It wasn't much, a small circular space in the woods, with tall grass growing in the center and a few scattered rocks around the edges. But there, at the farthest corner of the clearing, I noticed something. A figure. It was a man, old, bent over, with a long tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. He stood motionless, like a statue, watching me with an intensity that sent a ripple of cold dread down my spine. He hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. But now he was standing just on the edge of my vision, as though he had always been there, waiting for me to notice. For a moment, I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, my mind screaming at me to run, to get away, but my body refused to obey. The old man didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, as if he had been expecting me. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step forward, my feet dragging as though weighed down by some invisible force. The closer I got, the more my senses sharpened. I could hear the faint rustling of his coat as it shifted with the breeze. I could see the dirt and grime that clung to his clothes, the faded patches of fabric that looked as though they had been worn for decades. But what struck me the most was the silence. It was as though the world had gone completely still in his presence. The forest had become eerily quiet again, as if holding its breath. And then, just as I was within a few feet of him, the man spoke. "Do you hear it?" he asked, his voice raspy, cracked with age, but clear. I stopped, confused. "Hear what?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. "The sound of the trees," he said slowly, as if the words had taken years to form. "They speak, you know. They always speak." I stared at him, unsure how to respond. The man's words didn't make any sense. What was he talking about? Trees didn't speak. "Do you hear it?" he repeated, his voice growing louder, more insistent. I shook my head, stepping back. "I don't hear anything," I replied, my voice trembling. The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and shuffled away, his form disappearing into the dense underbrush. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where he had been, the echo of his strange words lingering in the air. "The trees speak." I didn't understand what he meant, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I had no explanation for what had just happened, no reason for the encounter, but the eerie stillness that had fallen over the forest seemed to suggest that something had changed. Something had shifted in the very fabric of the woods, and I was now more certain than ever that I wasn't alone in them. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but the air was thick with tension, and the silence felt suffocating. As I resumed walking, the path seemed even more twisted than before, the trees growing closer together, their limbs reaching out like fingers, trying to ensnare me. The oppressive weight of the woods seemed to press down on me, but I had no choice but to keep moving forward. I couldn't stop now, not after what I had seen. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that was far older, far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The woods, which had already seemed foreign and unsettling, began to take on a new, more ominous life of their own as I pressed deeper into the forest. Every step I took felt heavier, the air colder, and the feeling of being watched stronger than before. I couldn't explain it, but something had shifted. It was as if the very essence of the place had changed. What had once been a quiet, serene trail was now a haunted labyrinth designed to trap and isolate anyone who dared venture too far. The woods had never seemed this alive before. Every rustle in the brush, every creak of a tree in the wind felt deliberate. It felt as though the forest itself was aware of my presence, as if it were silently plotting my fate, and I was nothing but a guest in its realm. And then it happened. I was walking along the winding trail, my thoughts a mess of fear and confusion, when the air around me thickened. The usual chill had escalated into a biting cold that gnawed at my bones. My breath came out in misty puffs, each one seeming to freeze in midair before dissipating. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, wishing for some sense of warmth, but it was no use. The cold had wrapped itself around my body like a shroud, refusing to let go. It was then that I heard it. A sound. Not a rustle of the leaves, not the sound of animals skittering away, but something far more sinister, a deep, resonating hum that vibrated in the air itself. It wasn't just in my ears, it was everywhere, inside me, around me, filling the very space I occupied. The hum wasn't like anything I had ever heard. It was as though the forest itself was alive and humming in response to some unknown force. I stopped, heart pounding, and turned in circles, trying to locate the source of the sound. There was nothing, no movement, no visible disturbance, just the heavy weight of the air pressing down on me. The hum grew louder, more intense, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. Suddenly, the forest fell silent. The hum stopped. The rustling ceased. The wind, which had been whispering through the trees just moments before, was gone. For a brief, terrifying moment, there was nothing but stillness. And in that silence, I heard something else, a voice. A low, guttural whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but as I strained my ears, it grew clearer. Don't turn around. My blood ran cold. I froze in place, my muscles locked in terror. The voice wasn't coming from behind me. It wasn't coming from any direction at all. It seemed to fill the very air around me, like the forest itself was speaking to me. I forced myself to take a shaky breath, my chest tight as I tried to rationalize the situation. I was hallucinating. That had to be it. The isolation, the pressure of the journey, the strange encounter with the old man, it was all getting to me. But as I turned slowly, my gaze falling on the path ahead, I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the center of the trail, right where the path forked. The figure was tall, cloaked in a dark, tattered robe, and I couldn't make out its features. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a hood, but I could feel its presence, the weight of its stare. The very air around it seemed to ripple, as though the figure itself was bending the reality around it. I stood rooted to the spot, my mind reeling. I had never seen anyone like this in the woods before. There was no way I had missed someone. No one could have walked this path without making some sound. And yet, here this figure was, standing in front of me as if it had always been there, waiting. "Who are you?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It only tilted its head, slowly, almost curiously, as though considering me. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo in my mind rather than my ears, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." My breath caught in my throat. Every part of my body screamed at me to run, but my legs were like lead, unwilling to move. The figure's words, though soft, carried an undeniable weight. It wasn't a warning, it was a statement of fact. And the sense of dread that washed over me, that cold certainty that I had done something terribly wrong by stepping into these woods, made my heart race. "Who are you?" I asked again, but my voice cracked, betraying my fear. This time, the figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, and unnaturally smooth. There was no sound from its feet, no rustling of leaves as it moved. It was like it was floating. The silence around it seemed to deepen, thickening in the air until the forest was completely still. It stopped just in front of me, so close that I could feel the cold radiating off it. I looked up into the hood, hoping for some sign of life, some clue as to what it was. But there was nothing, just darkness. The figure reached out slowly, its hand long and pale, and touched my cheek. The cold of its touch sent a shock through my body, and I gasped, stumbling back. The moment my foot hit the ground, the forest around me seemed to shift. The trees groaned, the ground trembled, and the air hummed with that strange, unnerving resonance. And then I saw it. The figure's hooded face began to shift, its features distorting like a melting mask. The darkness within the hood started to swirl, revealing something far worse than I could have imagined. What I had thought were empty spaces were filled with eyes, countless eyes, all staring back at me, unblinking. Some were large and round, others narrow and slitted, and they blinked in unison, as if they were all part of the same terrible creature. I screamed, stumbling backward, but no sound came from my mouth. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of my lungs. The figure's form started to grow taller, its shadow stretching across the forest floor, twisting and warping. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. I was alone again. I stood there, trembling, unable to process what had just happened. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath shallow, and my limbs felt like jelly. The forest around me felt different, no longer silent, No longer still, it was alive, humming with some unseen force. The weight of the woods pressed down on me, and I knew, without a doubt, that I had seen something that wasn't meant to be seen. I had walked into something far beyond my understanding, and now I was trapped in its grip. Terror gripped me, and I knew I had to leave. But the path ahead was no longer the one I had walked down before. It was different now, winding in strange directions, as if the forest itself had shifted, sealing off any chance of escape. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew there was no running. I had come too far, seen too much, and now the forest would not let me go. I didn't run. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was the overwhelming sense of dread that had rooted me to the spot, or maybe it was the crushing realization that running would be pointless. The woods were no longer a place I could simply navigate through. They had become a maze, one designed to disorient and trap me, and even if I had somehow tried to flee, I didn't know if the path would lead me out. Instead, I stood there, frozen, my mind desperately trying to piece together what had just happened. I wanted answers, hell, I needed them. But the forest around me offered no clarity. The air was thick with that unsettling stillness, and the cold had only deepened. The strange hum that had filled the air earlier had faded, but in its place was an oppressive silence that clung to the trees and pressed against my chest. The rustling of the leaves, the chirping of insects, all the normal sounds of the forest had disappeared. Now it was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Waiting for me. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart pounding, unsure of what I was hoping to find. The figure, the thing that had appeared before me in that fleeting, terrifying moment was gone. Yet, in some ways, it hadn't really left. Its presence lingered, hanging in the air like a shadow I couldn't escape. I wanted to turn back, to leave this nightmare behind, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how futile that idea was. The path I had been walking was gone. The familiar trail that I had followed hours before had transformed, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. It was as though the woods were shifting, closing off my only escape. Every direction I looked seemed to hold nothing but dense trees and tangled underbrush, the way forward and the way back indistinguishable. I was lost, and I couldn't even trust the ground beneath my feet anymore. I remembered the old man, his face, his strange questions, his odd smile. His words now felt like a warning, but I hadn't understood them then. "Are you sure you want to know what's out there?" He had asked me that when we crossed paths, and now, standing in the heart of these cursed woods, it seemed like he had known exactly what I would encounter. A cold chill ran through me as I looked up, half expecting to see him standing nearby, watching me from a distance. But there was nothing. The woods were silent. I had to find a way out. I had to. As I walked deeper into the woods, every step seemed to take me farther away from any sense of safety or comfort. The trees felt closer now, the underbrush thicker. I had no idea how much time had passed since I'd first set out on this hike, but I could feel at the pull of something unnatural, something that didn't belong here. Something that was now aware of me. I tried to make sense of it all. My heart was still racing from the encounter with the figure, and the unnerving sense of being watched hadn't let up. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but it wasn't a hallucination. I knew that. There was something in those eyes, those countless eyes, that proved it. They were real. This was real. The question I kept asking myself was why? Why had it happened? What did I see? What was the thing in the woods? The more I thought about it, the more the answer slipped away from me, like sand through my fingers. Every explanation I tried to piece together only seemed to unravel more questions. I couldn't stay here, not in this place. I turned around again, trying to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. The path I had followed was gone. The trees had shifted. The rocks I'd passed were no longer in the same places. It was like I had stumbled into some kind of distorted reality where nothing made sense. As I pressed on, panic began to take hold. The calm, rational part of my brain was screaming at me to stop, to think this through. But fear had already taken over. I couldn't help myself. I kept walking, faster now, my mind racing. Suddenly, a low growl broke through the silence, sharp and guttural. It came from behind me. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It wasn't an animal sound. It was something else. It was close, so close that I could feel the vibrations in the air. The growl echoed around me, filling the space, making the forest feel even more alien. I didn't want to look, but I had no choice. My body moved of its own accord, slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows in the distance. And then I saw it. Not the figure from before, but something different. Something just as terrifying. Emerging from the darkness between the trees was a shadow, tall, dark, and impossible to define. Its shape seemed to shift and change, as though it wasn't truly solid, more like a mirage, but it was undeniably there. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was moving toward me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going anymore, but I had to go somewhere, anywhere. My legs burned, my heart hammered, and the sound of my footfalls seemed to be swallowed by the thick air around me. I could still feel the presence following me, growing closer with every step, but I dared not look back. I ran and ran until the ground beneath my feet began to slope upward. The trees began to thin out, the air cleared just a little, and I could see a faint sliver of sunlight breaking through the canopy. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but the sensation of being trapped started to fade. My steps became slower, more deliberate, and I finally allowed myself to look around. I couldn't tell how long I had been running. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. I had to find a way out. The eerie growl that had haunted my steps was gone, but I knew better than to think I had escaped whatever had been chasing me. This place, this forest, wasn't just a physical location anymore. It had become something else. The further I went, the more I began to hear familiar sounds again, the distant call of birds, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, but I still felt the weight of the woods pressing in on me. I wasn't free yet. The woods might have let me go for now, but I knew deep down that I would never be truly free from what I had encountered here. Eventually, I reached the edge of the woods. The forest behind me looked unchanged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked. That whatever I had seen, whatever I had felt, was still with me. I stumbled out of the trees and into the open, the familiar sight of the trailhead ahead of me. My car was parked a short distance away. It looked so ordinary, so safe, but I couldn't bring myself to approach it just yet. I stood there, gazing back at the woods, unable to shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. In the days that followed, I tried to forget. I tried to convince myself that I had been exhausted, that I had been lost in the woods and had imagined the whole thing. But that feeling, the one that gnawed at the pit of my stomach, every time I thought about the figure, the eyes wouldn't go away. The forest had left an imprint on me, a memory I couldn't escape. I never went back. And I still don't know what happened out there. All I know is that something in those woods wasn't human. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. And maybe it wasn't meant to be seen at all.